I stood in the doorway, the smell of roast turkey and laughter spilling out from the house that used to be mine. My own son's voice cut through the warmth. We already have a father at the table. The words hit harder than winter air. The door closed before I could speak, my reflection staring back from the glass. A father replaced, erased, and left standing on his own porch with a gift that suddenly meant nothing. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Morning sunlight slips through thin blinds, painting tired golden lines across Robert Hayes's kitchen table. The clock ticks past 8. It's Father's Day. The house is quiet. Too quiet for a man who once woke up to breakfast smells and laughter. Now it's just the hum of the refrigerator, the soft sigh of an old man waiting for something he isn't sure he deserves. A knock at the door. He straightens his shirt, smooths his thinning hair, and opens it to see his daughter, Melissa, all polished confidence, holding a glossy gift bag. Behind her stands Ethan, her husband, his boss, grinning like someone who enjoys his own reflection. Little Ava bounces between them, clutching a crumpled drawing. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," Melissa says, her tone practiced, not warm. He smiles, grateful anyway. "You didn't have to, sweetheart." Ethan claps him on the back, too hard. "Come on, Bob, open it. We can't wait." Robert pulls out the first thing, an old pair of socks. He frowns, confused. They're his, worn and faded, folded neatly like a joke from his own drawer. Beneath them, a cheap white mug with bold blue letters, "Best Old Guy." For a heartbeat, no one speaks. Then Ethan chuckles. "Guess you're not worth a Rolex yet, Bob." Melissa joins the laugh, soft, uneasy, but she laughs anyway. Robert forces a smile, the kind that hides a bruise. He turns the mug in his hand. It's light, hollow, clumsy. "Thought it'd make you smile," Melissa says quickly. "You always lose your socks." "Yeah," he murmurs. "That's me." He sets the mug down gently, as if it might shatter. Inside, something already has. The air feels heavy. He glances at Ava, who's biting her lip, watching. She climbs onto his lap, her tiny hands warm on his arm. "I'll get you a real gift when I grow up," she whispers. His smile this time is real but fragile. "That's more than enough, honey." She nods, proud, unaware of the storm gathering behind her grandfather's eyes. Ethan checks his watch. "We better go. Got that investor lunch." He tosses a quick nod. "Don't work too hard, old man." Melissa hugs her father, her perfume sharp, distant. "We'll call you later," she promises, already turning toward the door. When they leave, the silence returns. Louder now. Robert sits there, socks on the table, mug beside his cooling coffee. He studies the mug again. The blue letters swim in reflection, distorted by tears he refuses to let fall. He thinks of past Father's Days, back when his wife, Clara's best friend Mary, was alive, when Melissa was little and spent weeks saving allowance to buy him something small but thoughtful. He remembers the bike he gave her every birthday, even when money was tight, just to see her ride down the street, hair flying, shouting, "You're the best, Dad." How far away that sound feels now. He picks up the socks again, rough cotton against his fingers. Old, yes, but not worthless. He wonders if Melissa even noticed they were his, if Ethan found them funny, or if both simply forgot who had kept their world standing all these years. Outside, a lawnmower starts. A neighbor laughs. Life moves, indifferent. Robert exhales, long and slow. His reflection in the coffee looks older than he remembers, lined with years of quiet loyalty, of swallowed pride. For decades, he's fixed the company's machinery, trained the young ones, stayed late without complaint. Ethan took over, promised modern ways, shiny systems, and respect for the old guard. But respect turned to orders, gratitude into mockery. And now this, a joke gift from his own blood. He leans back in his chair. The cheap mug catches a stripe of sunlight, glinting almost gold for an instant, like it's daring him to see something different. He reaches for his wallet. Inside, a folded photo. Melissa, maybe 10 years old, covered in grease after helping him fix her first bike. Her grin is pure pride. "Like you, Dad," she'd said. Robert sets the photo beside the mug. For the first time all morning, his expression hardens. Beneath the gentleness, a quiet current of hurt sharpens into focus. He stands, moves toward the window. From here, he can see the edge of downtown, where the Hayes Miller Logistics building gleams in the distance. His name is half of that title, carved into glass, but lately it feels like it belongs to someone else. He takes a slow breath. The hum of the refrigerator fills the space again, steady and low, like a heartbeat. His eyes narrow slightly. The camera of memory zooms in. Socks, mug, laughter, all just fragments, but they fuse into something new inside him. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, stronger. He picks up the mug one more time, turns it slowly, and whispers to no one, "We'll see who's old." The words hang there, light, almost calm, but in that still kitchen, they sound like the start of something that won't end gently. The Monday after Father's Day dawns gray, the kind of morning that feels neither new nor forgiving. Robert Hayes parks his old pickup outside the Hayes Miller Logistics building, his second home for almost 3 decades. The air smells faintly of diesel and rain. Workers in neon vests wave as he steps out, toolbox in hand. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," one of them calls. Robert smiles. "Morning, fellas. Keep that line running smooth today." They grin because they mean it. They like him. To them, Robert isn't just another employee. He's the reason things still work. He's the man who taught them how to fix the forklifts when management said to just replace them, who stayed late to help even when his shift was long over. He's the quiet pulse behind the noise of the warehouse. Inside, the building hums, conveyor belts rolling, intercoms buzzing, forklifts beeping. Robert moves through the space like someone moving through his own house. Every bolt, every hum, every vibration, he knows by heart. Then comes the change in atmosphere. Laughter from the glass-walled office upstairs. Expensive cologne trailing down the steps before the man himself appears. Ethan Miller, sharp suit, perfect grin, sunglasses still on though there's no sun inside. "Morning, team," Ethan says, his voice echoing like a performance. Robert nods politely. "Morning, Ethan." Ethan glances down as if only half seeing him. "Bob, my office floor's got a coffee stain near the door. Mind handling that when you're free?" Robert blinks once, then nods. "Of course." The younger workers look at each other. They know what Robert really does. Maintenance supervisor, not janitor, but nobody says a word. The silence in the warehouse feels heavier than the machines. Ethan strolls past, phone in hand, laughing into it. His voice fades toward the executive wing. Robert exhales and kneels beside a humming compressor, tightening a loose valve. The clang of his wrench echoes like punctuation to an insult. Dylan Parker, his protege, walks up with a clipboard. "You shouldn't have to take that, Mr. Hayes," he says quietly. Robert gives a small smile. "Don't worry about it, kid. Pride's like a leaky pipe. Tighten it too much, it bursts." Dylan wants to protest, but the look in Robert's eyes tells him not to. A little before noon, Melissa appears. He sees her reflection first, heels clicking, tailored suit immaculate, eyes on her phone. She's grown into a mirror of her husband's world. "Hey, sweetheart," Robert says, standing up, wiping his hands on a rag. She looks up briefly, startled. "Oh, hi, Dad." Her tone is polite, distant, the kind of greeting you'd give a neighbor you barely know. She glances around nervously, like she's afraid someone might see her talking to him. "Is Ethan in?" "Upstairs," Robert says. "He was asking about that coffee stain." She smiles faintly, not at the joke, but because she's not really listening. "Thanks." He watches her walk away, every step echoing against the warehouse walls. Minutes later, he hears voices. Ethan's laugh again, loud, careless. Through the half-open office door, he catches a fragment of the conversation. "Old Bob's a relic," Ethan says, "but he's cheap labor, keeps the books balanced." There's laughter. Ethan's, Melissa's, someone else's. The words hit like a nail sliding under skin. Robert stands still, wrench in hand, heartbeat steady but deep. Dylan across the room notices. Their eyes meet for a moment. "You heard that?" Dylan asks quietly. Robert nods once. Yeah. Dylan's jaw tightens. You want me to? It's okay, Robert interrupts softly. He sets the wrench down, wipes his palms slowly, almost methodically, like he's cleaning off the last trace of something invisible. I've built bigger things than pride, he says. Dylan watches him walk away toward the back of the warehouse. Slow, steady steps, the kind that carry a lifetime of patience, and something darker beginning to stir beneath it. Upstairs, laughter still echoes. Down below, the machines keep running, but the sound now feels different, like a warning before something breaks. The invitation comes in a company email that looks almost out of place in Robert's inbox, his first time being summoned to a management meeting in years. The subject line reads, "Strategic alignment, attendance required." No greeting, no signature, just a date, a time, and the company logo that still bears his last name. When Monday arrives, Robert polishes his boots, presses his shirt, and carries his worn leather notebook like it's armor. The conference room sits at the top floor, all glass walls and city views, a world he helped build but rarely enters. Inside, sleek suits and manicured smiles fill the table. A large screen glows with graphs and corporate buzzwords: optimization, scalability, market dominance. Ethan stands at the head, beaming with the energy of someone who enjoys his own voice. Glad everyone could make it, Ethan begins, and a special shout out to our founding legend, Mr. Robert Hayes. A few polite claps ripple around the table. Robert nods modestly. He senses it already. The performance in Ethan's tone, the falseness behind the word legend. Ethan grins wider. Figured it's time to show our veterans some appreciation, right? After all, Bob here's been with us since the Stone Age of logistics. Laughter. Loud, easy, obedient. Robert offers a small, practiced smile. Ethan gestures to the screen. Let's dive in. We're going over Q2 metrics. Bob, don't worry. We'll keep the digital stuff simple for you. More laughter. Robert folds his hands. The sound doesn't sting anymore. It lands like an old echo. He waits, patient as always. Slides flash by. Profits, percentages, projections. Robert listens. Beneath the jargon, he hears what no one else seems to. The hum of broken machines behind the numbers, the inefficiency buried under presentation gloss. When the floor opens for input, Robert clears his throat. If I may, he says. The room quiets. He opens his notebook. Real paper, handwritten. I've reviewed our maintenance logs. Half our conveyor systems are outdated. They cost us 20% more in repairs each quarter. A small modernization, just new motor belts and recalibrated sensors, could save the company close to $150,000 a year. He slides the paper forward. Notes, figures, dates. The old-school precision of a man who knows every bolt and wire by heart. Ethan doesn't even glance down. He smirks. Bob, that's adorable, but we're talking digital metrics, not nuts and bolts. A chuckle runs around the table, cautious but real. Ethan feeds off it. See, folks, that's our Bob, always thinking small, always about machines instead of markets. Robert doesn't respond. He just closes his notebook quietly. The sound is soft, final. The meeting moves on, fast, as if he never spoke. Charts resume flashing, voices overlap. But Dylan, sitting 2 seats away, keeps looking at Robert, at the calm expression that hides something much deeper. When it's over, chairs scrape back. People rush to calls and lunches. Robert stands slowly, gives a polite nod, and leaves the room. He walks the corridor lined with framed achievements, photos from early days of the company. One shows him beside Ethan, back when it was just a warehouse and a dream. He pauses there for a moment. The younger Robert in the photo smiles without knowing how the story would twist. Downstairs, Dylan catches up. You didn't deserve that, he says quietly. Robert shrugs. He's the boss. No, Dylan insists. He's threatened by you. Robert turns to him then, eyes steady, voice calm. Threats come from fear, he says, and fear always trips first. Dylan doesn't fully understand the weight behind the words. Not yet, but the look in Robert's eyes tells him something's shifting, something patient but unstoppable. As Robert walks back toward the warehouse floor, The sound of machines swells, steady, rhythmic, waiting. Upstairs, the laughter of executives fades behind glass walls, and though no one notices, the balance inside the building has begun to tilt, ever so slightly, toward the man they still call old. The invitation comes midweek, written in Melissa's careful tone, polite but detached. "Dad, dinner at our place Friday night, just family. We'd love to celebrate you." Robert reads it twice, unsure whether to smile or sigh. Celebrate feels like a word from a different language now, one he hasn't heard spoken sincerely in years. Still, he accepts. Fathers don't turn down their daughters, even when the warmth feels borrowed. Friday evening arrives soft and warm. Atlanta's skyline glows like glass set on fire. Robert parks his old truck outside the Miller's house, a sleek, modern mansion with hedges trimmed as sharply as its owner's ego. The driveway alone could fit 3 of his homes. Melissa opens the door, elegant in a silk dress, her hair perfect, smile polished. "Dad, you made it." "Wouldn't miss it," he says, stepping in, handing her a small box of homemade fudge wrapped in foil. "Your mom's old recipe." "Oh, Dad, you didn't have to," she says lightly, already setting it aside. Ethan appears from the dining room, sleeves rolled, a decanter in hand. "Bob, just in time for the good stuff." He lifts a bottle toward the light. "Napa Reserve. Costs more than your truck, I bet." Robert smiles faintly. "Probably runs better, too." Ethan laughs, missing the edge in his tone. "Come on, let's eat." The dining table gleams under chandelier light. White linen, gold flatware, everything curated to impress. Robert sits at one end, Ethan at the other, Melissa and little Ava between them. The air smells of roasted duck and money. Dinner begins with Ethan narrating his own brilliance, new investors, a potential expansion, his visionary leadership. Each word drips with the comfort of someone used to applause. Melissa nods, adding phrases like strategic partnerships and long-term growth, her vocabulary echoing his. Robert cuts his food quietly, listening, his hands steady but distant. The knife scrapes the plate, the only sound he contributes. Ethan pours wine into Robert's glass. "You sure you're good with this vintage, Bob? It's a bit stronger than your usual diner coffee." Robert chuckles softly. "I've handled stronger." Ethan smirks, missing the weight again. The talk turns to vacations, Italy, yachts, private chefs. Melissa laughs easily, her fingers brushing Ethan's hand, pride sparkling in her eyes. Robert glances toward Ava, who's quietly drawing on her napkin. A crooked heart and 2 stick figures, one taller, one smaller, holding hands. "Who's that, sweetheart?" he asks gently. "You and me, Grandpa," she says. "We're fixing the birdhouse again." He smiles, a real one this time. "Guess we've got work to do then." Melissa looks over, half smiling. "Dad, you should take retirement soon. Enjoy your golden years. You've worked enough for 10 lives. He meets her gaze, calm. "Maybe when I stop building things." Ethan leans back, swirling his wine. "Some things outlive their usefulness, Bob. No shame in stepping aside before that happens." The words hang like smoke in the air. Melissa shifts uncomfortably, but doesn't correct him. Robert places his fork down slowly. "I see," he says. His tone isn't angry. It's something deeper, quieter. He folds his napkin, smoothing the creases with practiced care. "You might be right." Ethan raises his glass in mock toast. "To knowing when to quit." Robert doesn't raise his. Ava looks up at him, sensing the heaviness, though she can't name it. The rest of dinner blurs into conversation. Investments, politics, trends. Noise that bounces off crystal and marble, but never reaches anything human. Robert nods when needed, offers polite replies, but his mind drifts. Each laugh, each empty phrase feels like a wall closing in. When dessert arrives, something French and delicate, he pushes it gently away. "It's getting late," he says softly. "Oh, Dad, stay for coffee," Melissa offers, but there's no insistence in her voice. "Not tonight." He stands, pats Ava's head, thanks them both for dinner. Ethan nods, already refilling his own glass. Outside, the air is cooler, honest. Robert walks toward his truck, the sound of laughter spilling faintly from the house behind him. He pauses once before opening the door, glancing up at the lit windows. Through one of them, he can see Melissa tilt her head back, laughing at something Ethan says. He smiles, just barely, the kind of smile people mistake for peace. Then he drives home in silence. That night, the house feels emptier than usual. The fudge tin sits untouched on his counter. He lies in bed, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the city outside a dull echo of something unresolved inside him. He replays the words. Some things outlive their usefulness. And as the clock ticks past midnight, Robert's eyes stay open, unblinking, the weight of humiliation slowly hardening into something else. Not rage, but a purpose, taking its first quiet breath in the dark. The warehouse hums beneath fluorescent lights, another ordinary morning layered with the rhythm of machines and the quiet sighs of men who've been doing the same work too long. But something different hangs in the air today. A current Robert can feel more than name. Dylan finds him near the loading dock, eyes darting toward the cameras before stepping closer. "Mr. Hayes," he says, voice low. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Robert studies him for a moment, the nervous twitch, the folder clutched too tightly in his hand. "Break room," Robert says, nodding toward the back. Inside, the hum fades, replaced by the soft buzz of an old vending machine. Dylan sets the folder down, opens it like it's something radioactive. "I've been helping accounting reconcile Ethan's new expansion projects," he begins. "And I found irregularities." Robert doesn't blink. "What kind of irregularities?" "Missing funds," Dylan says. "Big ones, hundreds of thousands across different budgets. And fake invoices, vendors that don't exist, payments signed off under Ethan's name." The words land heavy. Robert sits slowly, fingers pressing against the edge of the table. "You're sure?" "I double-checked. Cross-referenced supplier IDs, tax numbers, shipment logs. It's all smoke." Dylan's voice cracks. "It's fraud, sir." For a long moment, neither of them speaks. The only sound is the hum of the refrigerator. Robert's face stays calm, but inside, something old and deep begins to turn. "Ethan's been funneling money," he says at last, more to himself than to Dylan. Dylan swallows hard. "We should go to corporate, or the board." Robert leans back, eyes narrowing slightly. "Not yet." "But, sir." "Not yet," he repeats, firm but gentle. "If we move too soon, it disappears. Evidence goes missing, stories change, people forget." He looks down at the folder. "We'll do this right." Dylan nods, uncertain but trusting. Later that day, Robert drives to Clara's house. She greets him at the door, silver hair pulled back, glasses perched on her nose, a woman who's seen too many truths to be surprised by any. "You look like a man carrying a weight he can't name," she says. He manages a thin smile. "Maybe I just forgot how light things used to feel." They sit at her kitchen table, tea steaming, the clock ticking softly in the background. Robert explains everything, the budgets, the invoices, Ethan's arrogance growing unchecked. Clara listens, her face tightening with each word. When he finishes, she leans back slowly. "Stay out of it, Robert," she says. "Power protects power. You go after a man like Ethan, you'll end up crushed under the same walls you built." He stares at the tea swirling in his cup, then sets it down gently. "Maybe," he says quietly, "but power forgets who keeps the lights on." Clara studies him, her eyes soft but sad. "You always were a stubborn builder." "Someone has to be," he replies. That night, back in his small kitchen, Robert clears a space on his table. He spreads out blueprints, old invoices, and printed email chains Dylan slipped to him on a flash drive. The fluorescent light hums overhead as he works, methodical and silent. He builds patterns the way other men build walls, connecting dots, tracing signatures, noting timestamps. His hands move with the same precision that once fixed broken gears, only now they piece together something more fragile, truth. Every discovery tightens the air. The fake vendors share addresses. The project ledgers repeat handwriting. The numbers always circle back to Ethan. Robert's patience, long mistaken for weakness, sharpens into precision. Each note he writes is deliberate, each file copied twice, each printout hidden in plain sight. He works like a craftsman building a clock, every tick a step toward reckoning. At one point, he pauses, glancing at the framed photo of his late wife on the counter. "You always said integrity was the last thing a man should lose," he murmurs. "Guess we'll see if I've still got mine." He smiles faintly, a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Outside, thunder rumbles, distant, low, the kind of storm that doesn't arrive suddenly, but builds in silence until the world can't hold it anymore. Robert switches off the light, leaving only the glow of his desk lamp on the scattered papers. He takes one last look at the company logo printed on a fraudulent invoice, Hayes Miller Logistics, his name, his foundation. He folds the paper carefully, almost reverently, and tucks it into a manila envelope. Then he whispers to himself, "Let's see how strong the walls really are." The clock ticks past midnight as Robert's eyes narrow. No anger, no haste, just focus. The builder in him has found a new structure to repair, and this one he intends to bring down from the inside. The sun hung heavy over the open field where Hayes Miller Logistics hosted its annual company picnic, a day meant for laughter, grilled food, and shallow displays of unity. The stage was set with banners bearing Ethan's face-sized logo, building the future together. Underneath the shade of an old oak, Robert Hayes stood beside Dylan, quietly sipping lemonade, his worn hands tucked in his pockets. Ethan arrived last, as always, crisp white shirt, designer sunglasses, and a confidence that drew attention like a spotlight. Cameras followed him. His laughter was just loud enough to sound rehearsed. He strutted to the stage, arm draped over Melissa's shoulder, and raised a glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan's voice boomed through the speakers, "today we celebrate success, our success. From humble beginnings to one of Atlanta's leading logistics firms, this is what vision looks like." The crowd clapped, some genuinely, others because they had to. Robert clapped too, slow, steady, polite. Behind his calm eyes, he studied the faces of men and women who knew the truth. They weren't here because of Ethan's vision. They were here because of years of quiet labor, his and theirs, the unseen scaffolding beneath the company's polished facade. As Ethan continued, he gestured dramatically toward the staff. "Let's hear it for our maintenance team, keeping our floors shining and machines running, and of course my dear father-in-law, Bob Hayes. He's been with us forever." Laughter rippled across the crowd. Ethan smirked, turning toward Robert. "Bob, why don't you take a break before you fall apart, huh? Don't want you passing out in front of the barbecue." Even Dylan froze. The joke wasn't light. It landed with a thud. The workers looked away, uncomfortable. Melissa forced a tight laugh, glancing nervously at her father. Robert stood still for a moment, eyes down. Then, with that familiar slow composure, he raised his gaze to meet Ethan's. The corners of his lips lifted into the faintest smile, not amused, not angry, but something unreadable. He nodded once, softly, and said, "You're right, Ethan. Maybe I should rest." Then he turned and began walking away, steady, unhurried steps through the murmuring crowd. The laughter faded behind him, replaced by awkward silence. Dylan dropped his drink and followed, catching up near the parking lot. "Mr. Hayes, you don't have to take that. He's—" Robert stopped him with a hand on the shoulder. "Let him think I'm broken," he said quietly. His tone wasn't bitter. It was deliberate. The proud never see the ground until they hit it. They stood by Robert's old pickup truck, watching as Ethan basked under the spotlight, oblivious to the quiet storm forming behind him. The smell of grilled food drifted in the air, but it didn't feel like a picnic anymore. It felt like a farewell. As Robert drove home, the image of Ethan's smirk replayed in his mind, not because it hurt, but because it revealed something deeper. Arrogance had a pattern, and this one was nearing its final loop. He parked outside his small house, the one he and his late wife had built brick by brick. Inside, framed photos of family in the past seemed to look back at him, the young father teaching Melissa to ride her first bike, the wedding where Ethan first called him Dad, Robert sat down at his kitchen table, staring at a folded file, the evidence Dylan had quietly slipped into his jacket pocket earlier that week. A quiet weight settled over him. Out the window, the sunset burned orange, bleeding into the horizon. Beautiful, but fleeting. He whispered to himself, let him have his moment. Because moments fade, truth doesn't. Robert leaned back, eyes heavy but focused, and reached for the folder. He didn't open it. Not yet. He simply rested his hand on it, feeling the pulse of quiet purpose under his fingertips. Tomorrow he knew the real work would begin, and for the first time in years, the thought didn't feel heavy. It felt right. The laughter from the picnic echoed faintly in his ears as the scene faded, like the last note of a song that no longer meant what it used to. The next morning, Atlanta was washed in the pale gray of early dawn. Robert drove through near-empty streets, his old pickup humming steadily as if it shared his thoughts, steady, heavy, and unspoken. On the passenger seat sat a thick manila folder, edges worn from his handling, sealed with a simple paperclip. Inside was everything: fake invoices, altered signatures, duplicate vendor accounts, the bones of a fraud hiding under corporate gloss. He parked outside a small brick house shaded by magnolia trees, Clara Brooks' home. The air smelled faintly of coffee and morning dew. Robert stepped out, folder in hand, knocking softly on the wooden door. Clara opened it with her usual composed grace. Her silver hair was tied in a low bun, her eyes sharp behind reading glasses. "Robert Hayes," she said, voice half surprise, half knowing. "You look like a man who's been holding his breath too long." Robert managed a tired smile. "Maybe I have." Inside, her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and paperwork, an odd mix that always reminded him of her. She gestured to the table, where ledgers and notebooks sat open like old friends. He placed the folder down between them. "It's all there," he said quietly. Clara flipped through the papers, her brow tightening as she scanned page after page. "He's sloppy," she muttered. "Didn't even bother to change patterns. Same handwriting, same amounts recycled, through shell vendors." Robert nodded, folding his hands together. Ethan never thought anyone beneath him could count that high. Clara looked up. "You know what this means, don't you? This isn't just firing ammunition, it's corporate destruction. If you go public, the company falls." Robert leaned back, his voice calm, deliberate. "If I leave right. No shouting, no chaos, just truth." Clara studied him for a moment, then reached for a blank sheet of paper. "You always were the clean one," she said softly. Her pen moved across the page in neat, practiced lines, crafting words that balanced resignation with warning. A quiet, legal trap disguised as dignity. As she wrote, the morning light fell through the curtains, striping the table in gold. Robert watched in silence. Every stroke of her pen felt like a countdown, not to war, but to balance being restored. When she finished, she slid the page across to him. "Your resignation," she said. "It's polite, professional, but it carries teeth. Anyone reading between the lines will know you're walking away with evidence." Robert read it slowly, his lips barely moving. "To the board of directors. After decades of service, I find it necessary to retire in peace and principle. I trust the company will continue to honor the integrity upon which it was built." He looked up and nodded. "Perfect." Clara leaned forward, voice low. "When do you want it sent?" He took a deep breath, glancing at the clock on the wall. "After Father's Day weekend ends. Let him have his show." Clara tilted her head. "You're going to teach, not punish, aren't you?" Robert's eyes softened. "Every builder knows. You dismantle carefully, tear it down too fast, and you ruin the foundation. But if you take it apart piece by piece, you can rebuild something better." A quiet pause settled between them. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler hissed to life, the sound steady and rhythmic. Clara nodded slowly. "You're a rare kind of angry, Robert. The kind that builds even while it burns." He smiled faintly, almost wistfully. "Maybe that's all I know how to do." She poured him a cup of coffee. The steam curled upward, catching the light like smoke from a distant fire. "So, what happens now?" she asked. Robert looked at the folder again. Now, I wait. Let him celebrate one more victory he doesn't deserve. The next time he laughs in a room, the walls will already be cracking. Clara leaned back, a mix of pride and worry in her eyes. Just be careful. Power protects power. He met her gaze, until it forgets who keeps the lights on. They shared a small, knowing smile. Two people who had seen enough of the world to know that justice, when done quietly, can be far louder than revenge. When Robert finally stood to leave, the folder was gone from the table, tucked safely beneath his arm. He opened the door to the bright mid-morning light, the weight on his shoulders somehow lighter now, not gone, but transformed. As he walked back to his truck, Clara watched from the window, murmuring softly, "Dismantle carefully, old friend. Carefully." Robert didn't hear her, but the look in his eyes said he already knew. By Sunday night, the city would sleep unaware. And by Monday morning, one empire would be standing on borrowed time. The week that followed felt like fog, slow, dense, and quiet enough for thoughts to echo. Robert arrived at Hayes Miller Logistics each morning just after dawn, the first one in, as always. But something in his rhythm had changed. No clipboard in hand, no quick steps across the maintenance floor. He moved like a man half present, doing only what duty required and nothing more. To everyone else, it looked like exhaustion, the old man finally running out of fight. Ethan, of course, saw it that way. "Guess the engine's dying," he joked to a group of executives over espresso. Took him long enough to realize this isn't a charity for retirees. The men laughed, eager to mirror their boss's arrogance. Dylan, however, saw what others missed. From his desk in the operations room, he watched Robert quietly organizing his files, sorting decades of reports into neat piles, labeling every binder with meticulous care. Each movement was deliberate, like a craftsman preparing to finish a project no one else could see. One afternoon, Ethan swaggered into the workshop with Melissa trailing behind, her designer heels echoing on the concrete floor. Robert was tightening a pipe under one of the loading docks. Ethan smirked. "Still doing the dirty work, huh? You could retire any time, Bob. No one would blame you." Robert looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Retirement's for those who've stopped building," he said calmly. Ethan laughed. "Right. Well, some things stop being useful long before they quit working." Melissa forced a polite chuckle, eyes darting between them. Robert simply nodded, saying nothing. Silence was his new language, sharper than argument, heavier than pride. When they left, Dylan approached quietly. "You're really not going to react?" he asked. Robert smiled faintly. "Let him think I'm fading. Sometimes you build faster in the dark." That night, in his small house on the outskirts of Atlanta, Robert sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread before him. Payroll sheets, vendor lists, and audit copies Clara had emailed under the radar. His reading glasses reflected the glow of a single lamp. He wasn't tired, he was studying. Every page was a brick, every number a nail, and slowly, the structure of Ethan's fraud revealed itself like a skeleton beneath polished skin. Clara called around 9. "I've gone through everything," she said. "It's worse than I thought. He's rerouted almost a quarter of the operational funds through ghost suppliers. He's even signed invoices under Melissa's authorization, without her knowing." Robert didn't flinch. That's how men like him survive, borrowing other people's names until they become empty. "You could take this to the board right now," she said carefully. "Not yet," Robert replied. "You don't knock down a wall before you know what's load-bearing." There was a pause. Clara sighed softly. "You always were patient to a fault." Robert glanced at an old photograph on the counter, a younger Melissa with her first bicycle, beaming under a summer sky. "Patience built her childhood," he said quietly. "It'll build her truth, too." Meanwhile, at the office, Dylan played his part. When Ethan questioned why certain files were missing, or why Robert hadn't been around as much, Dylan shrugged, pretending ignorance. "He's just tired, sir," he'd say. "You know how it gets at that age." Ethan bought the act easily. Confidence made him blind. He didn't see how Robert's absences lined up perfectly with Clara's phone logs, how each quiet day was another step in the slow construction of justice. Melissa remained oblivious. Her social media shimmered with polished perfection. Dinner parties, champagne glasses, photos captioned, "Proud of our empire, built from scratch." Robert saw them occasionally, always by accident. Once, during lunch, Dylan showed him a post. "Look," Dylan said awkwardly, "your daughter's trending again." Robert studied the photo for a long moment, Melissa smiling under soft lights, Ethan's arm around her. They looked like success made human. He said nothing for a while, then murmured, almost to himself, "They think value comes from applause." Dylan frowned. "What do you think it comes from?" Robert folded the napkin in his hand slowly, eyes distant. "From what you leave standing after everyone stops clapping." The next day, he left work early, telling no one why. At home, he packed a small box, one filled with memories rather than tools, a photo of his late wife, a watch given to him by the company decades ago, and the resignation letter Clara had written. He placed the letter in a drawer, unopened, waiting. Outside, rain began to fall. Light at first, then steady, tapping against the window like a quiet countdown. Robert leaned back in his chair, listening. Every drop felt like a reminder. Storms don't announce themselves. They gather, silent and patient, until the world has no choice but to look up. The morning began with the low hum of rain outside the office windows, soft enough to sound like static. Robert was in the workshop early, hands steady despite the weight of everything still unspoken. He'd grown used to silence, the kind that wasn't emptiness, but intention. Each quiet moment now had purpose. Dylan entered, glancing around before approaching. His face carried a tension that didn't belong to someone his age. "Mr. Hayes," he said under his breath, "the auditors are coming next month." Robert didn't look surprised. He only paused, wiping grease from his fingers with a rag. "External?" Dylan nodded. "Yes, Ethan requested it himself. Said it's a routine check before expansion. He doesn't know what's buried in those numbers." Robert set the rag down, a slow, deliberate movement. Then timing finally learned manners. The young man's eyes flickered with something close to admiration. "What are you going to do?" Robert smiled faintly, the lines on his face deepening. "Exactly what I've been building toward. Let the truth walk in by invitation." Later that evening, at his kitchen table, he opened his folder again. The papers were organized now. Dates, figures, signatures. Each page had the clean, calm order of a finished puzzle. But Robert knew presentation mattered. Truth didn't just need to exist. It had to arrive at the right time, in the right light. He unfolded Clara's resignation draft. It was perfect, elegant in tone. Every word weighted with quiet strength. Still, he read it again and picked up his pen. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, shaped by decades of filling out maintenance reports and safety checks. At the bottom, just before his signature, he added a single line in his steady hand, effective immediately upon discovery of impropriety. He stared at the words for a long moment. It was subtle, yet sharp enough to slice through any legal defense. If Ethan was exposed, even accidentally, Robert's resignation would trigger like a mechanism, placing him outside the company's collapse and leaving Ethan alone beneath the rubble. Clara called just as he was sealing the envelope. "You've been quiet," she said. "Quiet's the best noise before justice," he replied. She exhaled softly. "So it's done then?" He held the envelope up to the light, checking its seal. "Almost. One last delivery." "What's the plan?" "I'm mailing this to Ethan's home address, not the office. He'll open it when he's least prepared, maybe after another night of fine wine and false pride." Clara was silent for a moment, then said, "You're not angry anymore, are you?" Robert leaned back, looking at the rain streaking down the window. "No," he said quietly. "Anger's a hammer. I'm using a scalpel now." She chuckled softly, but her tone held admiration. "Sometimes I forget how dangerous honesty can be in patient hands." "Dangerous," he murmured, "or necessary." That night, he walked to the old post box at the end of his street. The streetlights flickered against the wet pavement, casting golden halos around puddles. He slid the envelope inside, hearing the faint metallic click as it fell. The sound was final, a whisper of inevitability. On his way back, he stopped by his truck and looked at his reflection in the side mirror. The face that stared back wasn't broken or bitter. It was composed, seasoned, a man who had outlived humiliation and turned it into quiet power. When he reached home, he called Clara again. "It's sent," he said simply. There was a pause on the line, then her voice came soft, certain. Sometimes the quietest gifts echo the loudest. Robert smiled, watching the street empty under the rain. That's the plan. He hung up, turning off the kitchen light. The house fell into stillness. Outside, the rain slowed, tapering into mist. Somewhere across the city, a letter was on its way, small, unassuming, sealed with restraint and consequence. In the silence that followed, Robert finally allowed himself to breathe. Not relief, not victory, but calm anticipation. The kind that comes right before foundations shift. The house gleamed that night. Polished marble floors, chandeliers dimmed just enough to make the gold accents glow. Melissa had gone all out for the occasion. The table was set with crystal glassware and monogrammed napkins, a small army of candles flickering between platters of expensive food. To any outsider, it looked like a perfect Father's Day dinner, wealth wrapped in warmth. But Robert knew the difference between shine and light. He sat at the far end of the table, posture straight, eyes kind but unreadable. Ava ran to him first, arms wrapping around his neck. "Grandpa, look, I made you this," she said, holding up a handmade card covered in glitter and uneven handwriting. Robert smiled, taking it carefully as though it were fragile glass. "This is the best gift I've had in years," he said. Ethan appeared behind her, a wine glass in hand. "Careful, Ava," he said with mock cheer. "Your grandpa's still learning how to hold things steady." The laughter that followed was sharp enough to sting. Melissa rolled her eyes playfully. "Oh, stop teasing him, Ethan. We got him a real gift this time." A neatly wrapped box was slid across the table toward Robert. He hesitated, then peeled away the wrapping. Inside, another mug, glossy white with bold black letters reading "World's Slowest Employee." Laughter again. Ethan clinked his glass. "A little workplace humor. Come on, Bob. Lighten up. You know we love you." Robert looked at the mug, then at them. His face remained calm, his voice soft. "You'll remember this gift longer than I will." Melissa blinked, unsure whether he was joking. Ethan smirked, already pouring himself more wine. Dinner carried on, full of laughter that didn't reach Robert's side of the table. He ate slowly, answering questions politely, contributing nothing to the noise. Ava stayed near him most of the evening, quietly sketching in her notebook beside his chair. Sometimes she'd glance up at him, her small brow furrowed, as if she sensed the stillness wasn't peace, but patience. When dessert came, Ethan raised his glass again. "To family," he said. "To success built together, generation to generation." Robert lifted his glass just enough to be polite. "To builders," he murmured, "and to what lasts." The toast dissolved into chatter. No one asked what he meant. That night, back at his house, Robert placed the mug on the shelf beside the one from last year. Best old guy. The two sat side by side, symbols of mockery turned into markers of time. He didn't touch them again. He sat at his desk, the clock ticking softly in the background. The email was already written, carefully, precisely. Subject line, "From one builder to another." He reread it once more, the message calm, factual, utterly unprovocative. "Ethan, as of this morning, I am resigning from Hayes Miller Logistics, effective immediately upon discovery of impropriety. I've attached copies of certain financial discrepancies for your review. I trust you'll know how to handle them, or perhaps the auditors. Will. Best, Robert Hayes." Attached below were PDFs of every fraudulent document, cross-referenced, time-stamped, and verified. Years of silent observation compressed into digital precision. He clicked "Schedule Send," set for 8 a.m. sharp. The same time, Ethan typically opened his inbox before his morning coffee. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of trees outside. Robert leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time in months, his breath didn't feel heavy. He thought of Clara's words, "Teach, not punish," and of Ava's handmade card, still glittering faintly under the lamplight. He smiled softly. Maybe she'll understand one day, he whispered. At dawn, sunlight spilled through the window, landing across his desk. The email timer blinked once, then sent. Across town, Ethan stirred awake in his mansion, phone lighting up on the nightstand. A subject line glowed in bold text, from one builder to another. He opened it, still half asleep, and the foundation began to crack. The conference room on the top floor of Hayes Miller Logistics felt colder than usual. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, slicing across the long mahogany table where the company's directors sat in uneasy silence. The air was thick with tension and the faint whir of the ceiling vent. Ethan paced at the head of the table, phone clutched in one hand, his tie slightly loosened. The usual confidence in his voice had been replaced with clipped panic. It's a misunderstanding, he said for the third time, eyes darting between the board members. Some files were duplicated, standard accounting errors. We'll have this cleared up in hours. No one spoke. Across the table, one of the shareholders, an older man with a heavy southern drawl, finally leaned forward. These errors have your signature, Ethan, multiple times. Are you saying someone forged the CEO's approval on fake vendor payments? Ethan's throat tightened. We delegate sign-offs sometimes. It's possible, Robert. But before he could finish, the door opened. Dylan stepped in quietly, followed by Clara. They took seats at the far end, silent, hands folded. Clara's eyes were sharp behind her glasses. Dylan's face was unreadable. The chairman, Mr. Hale, gestured toward them. We invited internal witnesses, he said flatly, just to ensure transparency. Ethan forced a thin smile. Of course, transparency. That's what I've always stood for. Clara said nothing. She opened a folder and slid a document toward the chairman, audit summaries, cleanly formatted with timestamps. Every line connected Ethan's personal authorization to the missing funds. The numbers spoke with the precision of truth, unemotional, merciless. The silence that followed felt like pressure in the air. Dylan shifted slightly, his gaze flickering toward the doorway. Sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow, steady, familiar. Then Robert walked in. He wasn't dressed for battle, just a plain gray shirt, worn boots, and a small leather briefcase in hand. He paused at the doorway, taking in the room, the people, the silence. Bob, Ethan said quickly, relief and fear tangled in his voice. Perfect timing. Tell them you've been handling maintenance, not finances. This is... Robert raised a hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. I'm not here for explanations. He walked toward the table, his movements calm, deliberate. The briefcase clicked softly as he set it down. I just came to drop off my toolbox, he said. The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. For a moment, no one understood. Then he opened the case. Inside, neatly arranged, were a few well-worn tools, a wrench, a screwdriver, a pair of gloves, and beneath them, an envelope marked Resignation, effective upon discovery of impropriety. The chairman reached for the envelope, opening it carefully. He read the short letter in silence, then looked at Ethan. You received this, didn't you? Ethan's face turned pale. It was mailed. I didn't realize... Robert spoke softly, almost kindly. You should always read what's handed to you, Ethan. Foundations crack when builders stop paying attention. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the board members whispered something under their breath, the kind of whisper that signals the shift of power. Melissa burst through the door then, her face flushed, eyes wet with disbelief. What is happening? She demanded, looking from Ethan to her father. They're saying you stole from the company. Ethan turned to her, desperate. It's not what it looks like. They're twisting things, Mel. She cut him off, voice breaking. You promised me everything was clean. Robert didn't move. He watched them quietly, his expression unreadable, not vindictive, not cruel, just deeply tired. Melissa's gaze snapped to him. Did you know about this? Yes, Robert said softly. For a while now. She stepped back, her voice trembling. You could have told me. He met her eyes gently. Would you have listened? The question landed heavier than any accusation. Across the table, the chairman cleared his throat. The auditor's report is final. Ethan Miller's authorization appears on every fraudulent transaction. Effective immediately, the board is suspending his leadership pending full investigation. Ethan sank into his chair, color draining from his face. His empire, built on arrogance and borrowed trust, was collapsing one sentence at a time. Robert reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded photograph. Melissa at 10 years old, holding her first bicycle, sunlight caught in her smile. He looked at it for a moment before setting it gently beside the tools. Then he turned to leave. Take care of the company, he said quietly, addressing the board. It was built by good people once. As he walked past Melissa, she called after him softly, her voice breaking through the silence. Dad. He didn't turn, but his hand brushed the doorframe as if leaving a final mark, a builder's touch, steady and sure. Behind him, the boardroom buzzed with panic, papers shuffling, voices rising. But Robert's footsteps stayed calm, measured, unhurried. The sound of a man, finally free. The walls of the boardroom seemed to close in as Ethan's composure finally cracked. The same man who once commanded entire departments with charm and fear now trembled, his voice raised, desperate. This is sabotage, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Robert's been planning this for months, planting evidence, whispering rumors, trying to destroy everything I built. No one flinched. The directors sat in heavy silence, their faces carved with disbelief and disappointment. A few exchanged glances, the kind that communicate quiet finality. The empire had already fallen. Ethan just hadn't realized it yet. Robert stood at the end of the room, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak until the noise of Ethan's rant began to fade. Then, with a calm that seemed almost surgical, he opened a folder and laid down several sheets of paper. Witness statements, he said evenly. Each one signed, dated, and verified by your own department heads. They describe where the invoices came from, who approved them, and who pocketed the difference. He slid the papers across the table, one by one, like evidence in a quiet courtroom. The directors leaned forward, scanning the signatures. Dylan's handwriting appeared on one, Clara's initials marked another. Even junior staff, employees Ethan barely remembered, had added their voices. Ethan's face turned crimson. You think this means anything? They're lying. They're all afraid of you, Robert. The old man with his quiet little threats. Robert looked at him, eyes calm but firm. The only thing people were afraid of, Ethan, was losing their dignity. You made that the price of working here. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The HR director, a woman who had once smiled nervously at Ethan's jokes, finally spoke. We've confirmed everything with the auditors. The discrepancies aren't random. They form a pattern, a deliberate one. The board chair adjusted his glasses, his tone cold and official. Effective immediately, Mr. Miller, you are suspended pending full investigation. Legal will coordinate with you for all further correspondence. The gavel of decision came down not with a bang, but a breath. Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around wildly, at the directors, at Dylan, at Clara, and finally at Robert, standing like a quiet shadow of justice. Melissa, seated at the far end, was trembling. Her face was pale, her hands clenched tight on the table. She stared at her father, the man who had raised her on lessons of strength, pride, and success, and saw a stranger drowning in his own reflection. You destroyed us, she whispered. Robert turned toward her slowly. His eyes were kind, but tired, not angry, just heavy with truth. No, he said softly, I just stopped building your lies. The words struck like a hammer, not loud, but final. Melissa stood abruptly, her chair scraping back across the floor. She slammed her palm against the table, her voice cracking. You could have walked away quietly. You didn't have to humiliate him. Robert didn't move. I tried quiet, he said, for years. The silence that followed was suffocating. Melissa's eyes glistened, but she said nothing more. She turned away, one hand covering her mouth, as if holding back a scream. Ethan slumped into his chair, face drained of color. The strength that had built his career, the arrogance that filled every room, had evaporated. He looked smaller now, fragile, his voice hoarse. "You think they'll remember you for this, Robert? You think you'll be the hero?" Robert's lips curved into the faintest smile. "No. Heroes fix things. I just stopped pretending they weren't broken." For a moment, even the air felt still. Then the board chair stood, nodding slightly in Robert's direction. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for your honesty and service. We'll make sure your record reflects it." Robert nodded once, collecting his briefcase, the same one that once held his resignation, now empty, but symbolic. As he turned to leave, the door opened before him. Outside, the corridor was lined with employees, the quiet, unseen people who kept the company alive. They didn't cheer at first. They just stood there, watching him pass. Then, one by one, hands began to clap, hesitant at first, then stronger, louder. Applause that rolled through the hall like a slow wave of gratitude and justice. Robert paused by the doorway, meeting Dylan's gaze briefly. The young man gave a small, respectful nod, the kind that passes between teacher and student, builder and apprentice. Robert smiled faintly. "Keep the lights on," he said. And with that, he stepped into the sunlight, the sound of applause following him out the door. Behind him, the building, the empire, still stood, but the foundation had shifted. Truth had taken its place. Ethan sat alone in the boardroom, the walls closing in, the silence deafening. His reflection in the glass window stared back at him, not the king of industry, but a man who mistook power for permanence. And outside, Robert walked steadily toward the parking lot, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon light, not triumphant, not bitter, but free. The story broke at dawn. Every local outlet carried the same headline: CEO under SIG. Investigation for financial misconduct. Ethan Miller's photo, the confident grin, the expensive suit, filled every screen. Beneath it, a single line caught more attention than the scandal itself. Evidence provided by longtime employee and co-founder Robert Hayes. By mid-morning, reporters clustered outside the Hayes Miller Logistics building. Cameras flashed. Microphones jutted toward employees walking in. Most had the same words ready. Robert was the honest one. He built this place with his hands. About time someone spoke up. The narrative had shifted overnight. Inside, the company buzzed with nervous energy. Ethan's office door was sealed, pending audit access. HR emails flooded in, announcing structural changes. And in one quiet corner of the operations floor, Dylan Parker stood beside Robert's old desk, his nameplate freshly replaced, acting operations lead. The ink on the memo was barely dry. Robert stopped by later that morning, wearing his usual flannel shirt and worn jacket. The factory hum felt different, cautious but hopeful, like the first breath after a long storm. Dylan saw him and straightened up. "They wanted to make it official today," Dylan said, a mix of pride and guilt in his voice. "I told them I couldn't take your chair. Not yet." Robert smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes but still carried warmth. "That chair was never mine to keep, Dylan, just to hold steady till the next pair of hands came along." Dylan nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. "You made it steady, sir." "Then make it honest," Robert said quietly. The two men shook hands, not as superior and subordinate, but as builders passing a torch. Later that afternoon, Clara arrived at Robert's modest home carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. The place was the same as always. Small garden, wooden porch, faint scent of oil and pine from his workshop out back. But something about him had changed. His shoulders were lighter, his voice steadier. "You look lighter," Clara said, setting a cup beside him. Robert leaned back in his chair, the sunlight catching the lines on his weathered face. "I've carried heavy things all my life," he said. "Now it's just peace." She smiled knowingly. "Peace looks good on you. Maybe you'll actually retire now?" He chuckled softly. "Maybe, but builders don't retire, Clara. They just find smaller things worth fixing." They sat in silence for a while, watching a pair of birds pecking at crumbs near the steps. For the first time in months, The world around him didn't feel like a burden waiting to collapse. It felt balanced, but balance didn't mean everything was mended. Melissa hadn't called, not once. Robert had left a few messages in the days following Ethan's suspension, gentle ones, without accusation or guilt. Just checking in, sweetheart. Hope Ava's okay. I'm here if you need me. But the replies never came. Each call went to voicemail. Each text stayed unread. He stopped trying after a week, not from bitterness, just acceptance. He knew the sound of silence when it carried shame instead of hatred. He'd heard it once before, years ago, after his wife's funeral, when Melissa had avoided his eyes because grief was easier to hide behind ambition. Some silences weren't walls. They were bridges waiting to be crossed from the other side. Clara noticed his gaze drifting toward the phone. "You'll hear from her," she said softly. He didn't look up. "Maybe, when she's ready." Clara sipped her coffee. "You're not angry?" Robert shook his head. "Anger's heavy. I don't have room for it anymore." He turned his attention back to the workshop in the corner of the yard, half-finished birdhouses lined neatly on the bench. Ava had painted one during her last visit, a crooked little thing with pink stripes, and her name scrawled on the roof. He traced the edge of it with his fingers. "They think value comes from applause," he murmured, half to himself, "but it's really built in the quiet, where no one's watching." The phone on the table buzzed once. A new notification. Local hero. The whistleblower who built with integrity. Some journalist's blog post, full of praise and dramatized quotes. Robert didn't open it. He didn't need headlines to validate him. His reward was simpler. The sound of birds outside, the faint hum of the city he'd helped build, and the peace of knowing that truth had finally found its footing. As the evening light dimmed, Clara rose to leave. "Don't stay up too late fixing those," she said, gesturing toward the birdhouses. He smiled. "Can't help it. Some things are easier to fix than people." When she was gone, he sat alone for a while, staring at the phone again. He didn't dial, didn't text. He just waited, quiet and patient, the way only a father can. Out in the yard, a breeze lifted the tiny birdhouse door. It creaked open and shut, a soft sound, almost like a whisper. Robert exhaled slowly. Maybe someday, that door, like his daughter's heart, would open again. Evening fell softly over the narrow streets of Atlanta's suburbs, the kind of stillness that makes the world feel paused between breaths. Robert Hayes turned the key in his front door, the faint creak echoing through the quiet. The house greeted him the way it always did. No noise, no rush, just the low hum of memory. The walls were lined with photographs, snapshots of a life before ambition poisoned simplicity. A young Melissa with gap-toothed laughter on her first bike. Clara and his late wife, Margaret, standing beside him at the company's old warehouse when it first opened. A tiny Ava in his arms, covered in birthday cake frosting. Every frame whispered a story, reminders of a time when love didn't need to be proven with gifts or success. He hung his jacket, took off his shoes, and walked into the living room. The clock above the mantel had stopped ticking days ago. An antique piece with brass hands and a pendulum that used to lull him to sleep during sleepless nights. He took it down carefully and placed it on his work table. The ticking mechanism was jammed, a small, almost invisible misalignment, like the kind that can stop everything from moving forward. Robert smiled faintly at the irony. He reached for his old toolkit, the one he'd kept since his early days fixing machinery at the plant. His fingers, still steady despite age, worked with slow precision. Screw by screw, gear by gear. The silence was full, not empty, a kind of peace that comes only when noise has finally spent itself. As he tightened the last screw, the pendulum swung once, hesitated, then found rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Time moved again. He exhaled, the sound almost a whisper. A knock broke the stillness. Robert opened the door to find Dylan standing there, holding a paper bag and wearing a look of awkward gratitude. "Hope I'm not bothering you, sir," Dylan said. "Not unless you plan to break my clock again," Robert said, gesturing him in. They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that clears the air rather than fills it. Dylan placed the bag on the table. sandwiches, coffee, something simple but thoughtful. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his tone earnest. "You changed the way we see respect at that place. Used to be fear, kept everyone in line. Now it's something else, something cleaner." Robert leaned back, studying him. "Respect isn't about titles, Dylan. It's about steadiness. Anyone can shout orders. Only a few can stand still when the noise starts." Dylan nodded, the lesson landing deeper than any lecture. "I'll remember that." Robert smiled, small, sincere. "Keep your dignity," he said quietly, "even when no one notices, especially then." They talked a little longer about the plant, the workers, the quiet sense of rebuilding that had begun after the storm. When Dylan finally left, night had deepened, the streetlights glowing faint through the curtains. Robert watched him walk away, proud, like a father seeing a son grow into his own strength. Another knock came just as he turned back toward the kitchen. This time it was Clara, coat buttoned up, hair slightly wind-blown, carrying a thick envelope. "I figured you'd still be up tinkering," she said, stepping inside. "Caught me," Robert replied, setting down his screwdriver. "What's that?" She handed him the envelope. "Auditor's final report. Officially clears you of any involvement. They even mentioned your cooperation. Said without your documents, they'd still be digging." Robert held the envelope, but didn't open it right away, just ran his thumb along the seal, feeling its quiet weight. "Guess that's that then," he said softly. "There's more," Clara added. "Ethan's facing prosecution. The DA's office is moving fast. He'll have to answer for everything." Robert's eyes flickered. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just a slow kind of closure. "He built his empire like it would never crack," he murmured, "but concrete's only as strong as its foundation." Clara smiled sadly. "You really should write a book, you know. Builders and their metaphors." He chuckled. "I just fix what's in front of me." She stayed a while longer, two old friends sharing coffee and quiet. No need for big words. The television murmured softly in the background. News anchors discussing ethics, leadership, rebuilding trust. Words meant for a crowd, but somehow they felt personal. When Clara finally left, Robert stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the yard. The repaired clock ticked steadily behind him, marking every second of reclaimed time. He let out a long, deep breath, the kind that comes not from exhaustion, but release. The old man finally exhaled. The house felt full again, not of people, but of peace. The air carried the faint scent of oil and wood, the heartbeat of a man who had built, lost, and built again. He glanced once more at the photos on the wall, his eyes resting on one. A faded picture of Melissa as a child, sitting on his shoulders, laughing into the wind. "Still building," he whispered, "still here." The clock answered softly in rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. It was late afternoon when Robert heard the soft crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. He wasn't expecting anyone. Clara had visited yesterday, and Dylan had promised to call next week. He wiped the dust from his hands, set down the wooden frame he'd been sanding in the workshop, and glanced out the window. A silver SUV sat idling near the fence. The driver's door opened slowly, and Melissa stepped out. She wasn't dressed for one of her polished social posts this time. No heels, no designer jacket. Just jeans, in sweater, and a face streaked with mascara she hadn't bothered to fix. For a long moment, she stood by the car as if unsure she should continue. Robert didn't move to meet her. He just waited. When she finally climbed the steps to the porch, her voice trembled. "You weren't answering my messages." He tilted his head slightly. "Didn't get any." She looked down. "Maybe I didn't send them." Silence stretched between them, not angry, just raw, the kind that hums with all the words people never learned to say. Finally, she took a deep breath. "You made me choose between my husband and you." Robert's expression didn't change. His voice was steady, gentle, but unyielding. "No, I never asked you to choose, Melissa. He made you forget who built your future and who was always standing behind it." Her eyes glistened. You think I don't know that now? Robert looked at her, not with judgment, but something deeper. Knowing and remembering aren't the same thing. Melissa turned away, staring at the empty swing set by the side of the yard, the one her daughter, Ava, loved when she visited. The wind rocked it gently, the faint squeak cutting through the quiet. I was angry, she said after a long pause. When everything fell apart, when Ethan's name was dragged through the mud, I blamed you, because it was easier than blaming myself. Robert didn't interrupt. He knew the shape of guilt, how it comes out only when silence feels safe enough. I kept thinking about all those years, Melissa continued, her voice breaking. You were always there, fixing everything. The house, my car, the company when Ethan needed help. And I treated you like a relic. Her shoulders shook. I don't know why I did that. Robert took a slow step toward her, his movements deliberate. Because sometimes success blinds people. You start thinking the walls built themselves until the cracks show. She laughed softly through her tears. You always have to talk in metaphors, don't you? He smiled faintly. It's how builders make sense of broken things. For a moment, they stood in silence again, the air filled with the rhythmic ticking of the clock from inside, the one he'd fixed weeks ago. Each sound marked a second reclaimed, a second closer to forgiveness. Melissa wiped her eyes, hesitant. I'm sorry, Dad. The words were small, barely audible, but heavy with meaning. Robert's jaw tensed, then softened. He reached out, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't the kind of hug that mends everything at once. It was distant, but sincere. The kind of embrace built on quiet understanding, rather than instant healing. Robert closed his eyes briefly. The warmth of her trembling against him felt both fragile and familiar. When she finally pulled back, he looked at her with that same patient calm he'd always carried. Some lessons, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Come after the applause. Melissa nodded, tears tracing down her cheeks. She looked around the porch, at the workshop, at the clock she could hear ticking faintly from inside. I see now what you were trying to teach me, she said softly. He nodded once. Good, then keep building. As she turned to leave, the air between them felt lighter, not whole, but healing. Robert watched her walk to her car, shoulders slumped, but freer somehow. When the engine started and the car disappeared down the road, he stood there a long while, watching the dust settle back into silence. The evening sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard, two side by side for just a moment before one faded into the other. By early autumn, the dust of scandal had settled into something more permanent. Restructuring, resignations, new beginnings built from old wreckage. At Hayes Miller Logistics, the nameplates were changing again, this time quietly, without the drama of headlines. The board moved swiftly. Ethan's suspension became termination. The legal documents were blunt: breach of ethics, financial misconduct, reputation risk. He tried to fight it, called in lawyers, begged for negotiations. But there was no empire left to bargain with. The empire had already learned to stand without him. Dylan was summoned to a board meeting soon after, his first sitting at the long oak table where he once stood taking orders. Robert didn't attend. He had made sure of that. But his influence, as always, was in the foundations. Silent, steady, invisible. That afternoon, Dylan called him. They're offering me partial ownership, he said, breathless. They want me to buy in, keep the company stable, but I don't have that kind of money. Robert's voice came through the line, calm and measured. You have something better. Trust. Let me handle the rest. Through Clara, the arrangements were made, quietly, discreetly, with no trace leading back to Robert. She drew up the papers, the investments folded under her name, a ghost of a signature that tied everything together. When the deal closed, Dylan officially became a shareholder, representing a private silent investor. Robert never asked for acknowledgement. That wasn't his way. Meanwhile, Ethan tried to rise from the ashes, a new startup, smaller, louder, desperate. But his name was poisoned now. Banks refused loans. Former partners declined meetings. Online, his scandal lingered like a scar that wouldn't fade. Even his charm, once effortless, now rang hollow. Robert heard about it from the news one morning. A headline scrolled across the TV. Former CEO Miller's comeback falters amid investor backlash. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, just turned off the television, poured his coffee, and looked out at the small birdhouse Ava had painted in his yard. He'd learned that not every victory felt sweet. Some were simply necessary. Melissa called later that week. Her voice was steadier than before. "I've filed for legal separation," she said. "Ava's staying with me." Robert paused, listening to her breathe on the other end. "That must have been hard." "It was," she admitted. "But I can't keep pretending stability means standing next to someone who never understood it." He said nothing for a moment, letting her words sit in the quiet. Then softly, "Pride can build tall walls, Melissa, but it's hard to live inside them." She sighed. "I'm starting to see that." For the first time in months, her tone carried something new. Not guilt, not shame, but resolve. He didn't tell her he was proud. He didn't have to. She would hear it in the pause, in the silence that followed. At the factory, Dylan called for a staff-wide meeting. The room filled with workers, mechanics, drivers, accountants, faces that had lived through every turn of the company's storm. On the projector, the new logo appeared, bold, clean, and simple. Hayes Logistics, built on integrity. The crowd broke into applause. Some cheered, some just smiled quietly. For them, the name wasn't about ownership, it was about truth restored. Dylan spoke briefly. This company was built by people who cared about what they made and how they made it. From this day forward, that's what we stand for again. Back at home, Robert stood by the window, phone in hand, watching the live stream of the announcement. The new sign went up above the entrance, his family's name shining against the morning light. Clara called soon after. "You did it," she said, her voice warm. He shook his head, though she couldn't see it. "No, Clara, they did. I just held the beam steady." Outside, the hum of life returned to normal. Trucks leaving the lot, men in hard hats laughing, a legacy rebuilt on something unbreakable. Robert set his phone down and whispered to himself, "Integrity holds longer than concrete." The clock ticked softly behind him. The house was still, but not empty, filled with the quiet pride of a man who had rebuilt without ever picking up a hammer. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the factory courtyard, the same space that once echoed with tension and whispers, now filled with laughter and applause. A banner fluttered gently above the crowd. Employee Appreciation Day, honoring the hands that built our future. Rows of employees stood shoulder to shoulder, faces lined with pride and relief. The chaos of the past year had finally given way to calm, a steady rhythm of honest work and fair leadership. Robert arrived quietly, as always. No fanfare, no escort. Just a man in his familiar gray jacket, walking through the gates he had once unlocked every morning for 30 years. Dylan met him near the stage, grinning like a man, who had been waiting for this day. "You didn't tell me it was going to be this big," Robert murmured, half smiling. Dylan chuckled. "You wouldn't have come if I did." He wasn't wrong. Music faded as Dylan stepped up to the microphone. "We're here today to celebrate the people who make this company what it is," he began. "The ones who show up early, stay late, and care about more than paychecks. The ones who build." He paused, glancing toward Robert. "Some of those builders leave behind more than work. They leave behind principles. Today, we honor one of them." At that cue, Clara and a few employees stepped forward, pulling a cover off a polished wooden bench near the garden walkway. A bronze plaque gleamed beneath the light, dedicated to Robert Hayes, the foundation we stand on. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a slow, rising wave of applause. Not polite, but heartfelt, thunderous. It wasn't for a whistleblower, or a retired worker, or a symbol. It was for the man who reminded them all what decency looked like when the world forgot. Robert stood still, hands clasped in front of him. He blinked slowly, eyes glistening, not from pride, but from recognition. Real respect, earned, not gifted. He finally walked forward, touching the cool metal of the plaque. The engraving was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had come before. The years of labor, the patience, the quiet choices that built something stronger than any boardroom promise. When he turned around, he spotted her, Melissa, standing near the back with Ava by her side. She was clapping softly, a faint smile on her face. It wasn't apology anymore. It was peace. He nodded to her, a gesture of forgiveness that needed no words. Ava waved shyly. "Grandpa, that's your name," he laughed, the sound carrying warmly across the courtyard. "It sure is, kiddo." After the ceremony, people came up one by one. Old co-workers, new hires, even security guards. Each had a small story to share. How Robert had helped them, mentored them, protected their jobs during layoffs. He listened patiently to each one, his heart heavy but full. Clara joined him as the crowd thinned. She handed him a cup of coffee, black, just the way he liked it. "You know," she said softly, "Ethan would never have understood this. Respect can't be bought. It's built, the same way you taught us to build everything else." Robert took a slow sip. "Builders always outlast destroyers," she added. He smiled. "That's because builders don't rush. They measure twice, cut once." They sat together for a while on the bench. Around them, the hum of the company carried on. The clang of metal, the murmur of conversation, the faint scent of machine oil mixing with spring air. Dylan walked over, crouching slightly to be at eye level. "You okay, old man?" Robert chuckled. "I'm better than okay, just watching my replacement. Run things the right way." Dylan shook his head. "Not a replacement, just the next beam in the frame you started." The three of them sat in quiet comfort, watching employees stream back inside. Melissa eventually approached, Ava tugging her hand. "Dad," she said softly, "I'm proud of you." He looked at her, really looked, and in her eyes, he saw the reflection of every long year that had led here. The lessons, the distance, the loss, the rebuilding. He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm proud of you too. You finally learned what success really means." She nodded, tears glimmering but controlled. "You taught me. Just took me a little longer to hear it." When they left, Robert stayed behind a little while longer, sitting on the bench with his name etched into its frame. The plaque caught the sunlight, and for a fleeting second, he saw his reflection, older, wiser, but steady. He leaned back, watching the workers move through the yard. Every sound felt alive again, not corporate noise, but human rhythm. And as the wind rustled the nearby trees, he whispered quietly to himself, "It was never about the building. It was always about what we built together." The applause had faded, but its echo lingered, in every nail, every wall, every person who walked those grounds. The morning light poured gently through the curtains, catching the edges of Robert's worn wooden desk. The house was quiet, not lonely, just peaceful in the way that silence can feel earned. He opened his drawer, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. The pen felt heavier than usual, maybe because this letter wasn't about business or betrayal. It was about legacy, something purer, something he wished someone had once written for him. He began slowly, each stroke deliberate. "Dear Ava, if you're reading this someday when I'm not around, I hope you're still asking questions, because questions build more than answers ever will." He paused, looking out at the garden where tiny white flowers swayed. "Build more than walls," he continued. "Build trust. It's the only foundation that doesn't crack under time or greed." The words came easier after that, about patience, kindness, and how dignity was the quietest kind of strength. He told her about mistakes too, not the kind that ruin you, but the kind that teach you who you are. He didn't mention Ethan by name, nor Melissa's tears. Instead, he wrote about forgiveness, not as surrender, but as release. When he signed his name, he didn't add Robert Hayes or Grandpa, just Builder. Later that week, Clara stopped by with mail. She smiled when she noticed the small envelope addressed in crayon handwriting. "Looks like someone's replied already," she said, placing it beside his coffee. Robert opened it with slow, careful hands. Inside was a simple drawing, Ava's small attempt at art. It showed him standing tall, a hammer in his hand, a crooked smile on his face. Above it, In uneven letters, she'd written, "My grandpa builds good things." For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, eyes misted. The drawing was clumsy, the proportions off, but it was the truest portrait he'd ever seen. He framed it that very afternoon, placing it on his desk where the sunlight hit just right. Clara walked by, teasing gently. "Retired, but still constructing wisdom, I see." Robert laughed softly, a deep, content sound that filled the space between them. "Maybe the best things we build," he said, "are invisible. Trust, lessons, love, things that don't show up on blueprints." As the evening settled, he leaned back in his chair, the faint ticking of the repaired clock marking each second of quiet satisfaction. The house no longer felt empty. The ghosts of guilt and vengeance had faded into memory, replaced by something simpler: peace. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain. Robert thought of Ava's little hands, her laughter, her unfiltered view of the world. He hoped she'd never learn to measure worth in power or applause. He whispered to the framed drawing, almost like a promise, "You'll build better than I did." And as the last light faded from the sky, Robert Hayes, the builder, the father, the man once broken by pride and betrayal, finally understood that the greatest structures are not made of steel or wood. They're built in silence, held together by truth, and passed down through love. Peace, at last, had become his masterpiece. The evening sun cast a golden haze across the old Hayes Miller factory, now proudly renamed Hayes Logistics. The building stood taller somehow, its glass panels reflecting the orange glow of dusk, like a quiet monument to perseverance. Robert slowed his car at the entrance, rolling down the window. The familiar hum of machinery, the clang of metal, the murmur of workers. It was the same symphony he'd once conducted, with his bare hands and weary heart. A few workers noticed his car. One of them, a young man in a hard hat, grinned and waved enthusiastically. Soon others joined, subtle nods, small smiles, the kind of respect that doesn't need applause. These were people who remembered, people who'd seen him walk the floors every day, not as a boss, but as one of them. Robert parked near the loading dock and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his shoes. The scent of motor oil and fresh paint mingled in the air. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the forklifts move in careful rhythm. It felt right. "Didn't think you'd ever step foot here again," came a familiar voice. He turned to see Dylan approaching, clipboard in hand, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, the same way Robert used to look after long shifts. Robert smiled. "Old habits die slow." Dylan laughed, offering a firm handshake. "We're expanding into 2 new warehouses next quarter. Freight demand's up, and we've modernized the entire tracking system." Robert nodded approvingly. "You've built something solid here." Dylan shrugged modestly. "You laid the groundwork. I just followed the blueprints." They walked together through the yard, Dylan explaining new logistics routes, employee incentives, safety upgrades. Robert listened quietly, eyes flicking between the machinery and the faces of the workers. There was pride there, not fear, not fatigue. Pride. That was new. When they reached the edge of the main warehouse, Robert placed a hand on the wall, feeling the cool steel beneath his palm. "Don't forget the foundations," he said, his voice low but steady. "A company isn't made of walls or numbers. It's built on people, the ones who stay late, who fix what others overlook." Dylan nodded solemnly. "Never will. Every decision we make, I ask myself, would you sign off on it?" Robert chuckled softly. "Then you're already doing it right." They stood in silence for a moment, teacher and student, builder and successor, watching the workers move like a living blueprint of everything they'd fought to preserve. As Robert walked back to his car, the sky deepened from gold to crimson. Dylan called out, "You know, we kept your old locker. The guys said it didn't feel right clearing it out." Robert smiled faintly. "Good. Some things belong where they started." He slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine. In the rearview mirror, the factory stretched behind him, strong, alive, honest. The new company sign caught the last light of the setting sun, glowing softly like a promise fulfilled. He caught his reflection. Older, lines etched deeper, eyes calmer. The man staring back wasn't burdened anymore. He wasn't broken, betrayed, or bitter. He was simply restored. As the car rolled down the quiet road, the factory faded into the horizon, but the feeling remained. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace. The kind of peace that comes when a builder knows his work will stand long after he's gone. And with the sunset burning in the mirror, Robert Hayes smiled. The foundation, finally whole again. The courthouse loomed over downtown Atlanta like a monument to consequence. Cold marble, mirrored doors, the echo of footsteps that always sounded heavier on judgment days. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones raised, lenses ready, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. And at the center of it all, Ethan Miller, once the polished CEO with diamond cufflinks and a grin that could sell air, now stood in a wrinkled suit, eyes hollow, pride collapsing in slow motion. Inside the courtroom, the tension buzzed like static. The gallery was full. Employees, shareholders, even curious strangers drawn by the scent of scandal. Melissa sat near the front, clutching a folded tissue in both hands. Her eyes were rimmed red, not from loyalty, but from the slow recognition of truth. Across the aisle, Ethan avoided her gaze, fidgeting as the prosecution laid out the evidence. Falsified invoices, offshore accounts, employee statements. Each document was another nail in the coffin of his empire. The company he'd once called his now stood in court as the victim. When Melissa took the stand, the silence was thick enough to press against the ribs. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke, recounting meetings she'd overheard, strange transactions she'd questioned but ignored. "I wanted to believe him," she said quietly, glancing toward the defense table. "But belief doesn't erase betrayal." Ethan shifted, jaw tightening, his arrogance trying to resurface. But the courtroom light was merciless. It revealed every crack in his confidence, every lie he'd once worn as a badge. The jury didn't need convincing. The truth had already built its own momentum. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, Ethan's body slumped like air escaping a balloon. The sound of pens, scratching notes, filled the void. He didn't look at anyone as the bailiff placed a hand on his shoulder. For the first time, there was no spotlight, no applause, no audience left to charm. Just silence. The kind that follows when the performance finally ends. Outside, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters called out questions. "Mr. Hayes, any statement about your son-in-law's sentencing? Do you feel vindicated after what he did to you?" Robert paused on the courthouse steps, coat buttoned neatly, face calm beneath the noise. "Some stories don't need retelling," he said softly. "They just need to end." Then he walked away, leaving the microphones dangling in the cold. Melissa caught up with him in the parking lot. "He'll be gone for years," she whispered, as if saying it aloud made it real. Robert nodded. "Then maybe that's time enough for both of you to rebuild, differently." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry for—" He stopped her gently. "You already spoke the truth where it mattered. That's apology enough." They stood there for a while, father and daughter, the same quiet between them that had once divided them now, offering something like peace. Across the street, news vans packed up, voices fading into distance. Later that evening, Robert sat alone in his workshop, the same place he'd once fixed broken engines and broken thoughts. A single lamp cast warm light across the bench. On the wall hung Ava's crayon drawing, a small reminder that legacies could be rebuilt with love, not power. He thought of Ethan, not with hatred, but with something closer to pity. Arrogance had been his foundation, and like all weak structures, it had collapsed under its own weight. When the 9 o'clock news confirmed the sentencing, 5 years in federal prison, restitution ordered, Robert turned the TV off midway through the report. Closure didn't need sound. He poured himself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward like quiet absolution. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the window pane. Not mournful, just cleansing. Robert watched it for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Some stories didn't need revenge. They just needed truth to finish the work. The morning sun spilled softly through the kitchen window, carrying with it the smell of sugar and melting butter. The counters were dusted in flour, the mixing bowls clattered gently. Sounds of life, sounds that had been missing from the house for too long. Robert stood at the counter in his apron, watching as little hands clumsily cracked an egg. Ava giggled when a bit of shell dropped into the bowl. "Oops," she said, scrunching her nose. "That's all right," Robert replied, his tone warm and patient. "Mistakes just add crunch." Melissa laughed. Not the performative kind she'd perfected in boardrooms and dinner parties, but the real, unguarded laughter of her younger self. For the first time in years, her voice carried light instead of strain. "You always said that when I was her age," she murmured, remembering mornings when her father used to hum while flipping pancakes. Robert smiled faintly. Some lessons survived the noise. As they worked, the kitchen filled with simple chaos, spilled flour, sticky spoons, laughter that echoed off tiled walls. Ava's hair was dusted white, Melissa's sleeves rolled up, and Robert looked on with quiet contentment, each small motion mending a crack left by years of distance. When the cookies finally baked, the scent filled every corner of the house. They sat together at the table, steam rising from the tray, sunlight warming their faces. Ava bit into one and smiled, crumbs catching on her chin. "Grandpa," she said. Suddenly, "Are you still mad?" The question caught Robert mid-breath. He looked at her, her eyes wide, innocent, reflecting none of the bitterness that had haunted the adults around her. He set his cup down gently. "Mad builds nothing, sweetheart," he said. "And builders, we fix things." Ava nodded solemnly, as if filing that truth away forever. Melissa watched the exchange, her lips trembling. The sight of her daughter's ease with him, the trust, the warmth, hit her harder than any courtroom verdict ever could. Without warning, tears spilled down her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her face, trying to hold herself together. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so blind. I let pride talk louder than love." Robert reached across the table, covering her hand with his own, rough, steady, forgiving. "You just forgot," he said softly. "But forgetting isn't forever." For a long moment, they stayed like that. No noise, no judgment, just the hum of the old kitchen clock, marking time that finally felt gentle again. Ava climbed into her mother's lap, wrapping tiny arms around her neck. Melissa smiled through tears, whispering, "We're okay now, right?" Robert nodded. "We're better than okay." Ava held up a cookie triumphantly. "Then this is our peace cookie," she declared. They all laughed, the kind of laughter that doesn't echo, it settles. It found its place between them, in the spaces where words had once failed. As the afternoon light softened into gold, Robert glanced toward the framed photo on the wall. Clara, Dylan, and the team at the bench dedication. Below it hung Ava's crayon drawing, Grandpa with a hammer. The colors had faded slightly, but the meaning hadn't. Melissa followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "You never stopped building, did you?" He looked at her with gentle amusement. "If I had, we wouldn't be here now." Outside, wind rustled the trees. The scent of baked cookies lingered in the air, sweet, simple, healing. And as Melissa leaned her head against her father's shoulder, Robert closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the quiet fill him. The builder had finished his longest project. Not a company, not a legacy, but a family rebuilt from the ground up. Healing, at last, had found its home. The warehouse had been transformed. String lights hung between steel beams, banners fluttered with handwritten messages. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," and "built on your strength." The air buzzed with quiet excitement, laughter echoing against the polished concrete. For once, the place that had been all work and motion felt like home, because it was built for the man who made it one. When Robert walked in, the surprise hit him like sunlight through fog. A crowd of familiar faces erupted in applause. Workers from every department, managers, even old retirees had gathered, clapping, cheering, smiling. Dylan stood front and center, a grin stretched wide across his face. "You didn't think we'd let you sneak off quietly, did you?" Robert blinked, momentarily speechless. You people are terrible at keeping secrets. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone handed him a cup of punch. Someone else patted his shoulder. It was noisy, imperfect, human, and it warmed him in a way words couldn't. As the speeches began, one by one, employees stepped forward. A young mechanic recalled the time Robert stayed late fixing a broken generator in the rain. A warehouse clerk mentioned how Robert had helped pay for her night classes without ever taking credit. A janitor shared how Mr. Hayes always said good morning, even when no one else did. Each story built on the next, forming a mosaic of quiet leadership, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that endures. Clara took the stage last, her posture proud, her voice carrying calm authority. "Robert Hayes," she began, smiling warmly, "you built more than a company. You built character. You reminded us that real work isn't about titles, it's about integrity. You've shown us that respect isn't earned through fear, but through consistency." The room fell silent, emotion thick in the air. Robert's eyes glistened, his hands folded in front of him. When Clara stepped down, Dylan joined her on stage, holding a small wooden box. "From all of us," he said, opening it slowly. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a gold hammer plaque engraved with the words, "Robert Hayes, the foundation we stand on." The crowd broke into applause again, louder this time. Robert took the plaque, running a calloused thumb over the engraving. The metal caught the light, shimmering softly. "Better than socks," he said with a crooked grin. Laughter erupted. Real, full, unrestrained. Even Clara chuckled, shaking her head. Dylan raised a glass. "To the man who taught us how to build right, and live right." "To Robert," the room echoed. Robert stood still for a moment, the noise washing over him. In every face he saw something familiar. Gratitude, respect, affection. All the things he'd once given freely, now returning to him in abundance. He wasn't the forgotten old man anymore. He was the legacy. He looked around at the warehouse, the very walls that had witnessed his struggle, his humiliation, his quiet victories. Now they stood as proof of something permanent. When the music started and people began to dance, Melissa appeared beside him, Ava tugging at her hand. "Grandpa," Ava said, holding up a cookie from the refreshment table. "These aren't as good as yours." Robert chuckled. "That's because you didn't help make them." Melissa smiled softly. "You really are impossible to replace." He glanced down at the gold hammer again. "Good," he said. "That means I built it right." As the night wound down and laughter softened into conversation, Robert felt something rare. Completion, the kind that doesn't come with trophies or titles, but with peace. He looked around the glowing warehouse, filled with the hum of people he'd shaped without ever trying to lead them. It wasn't just a retirement party, it was a monument to a life spent building, mending, and teaching. And as applause rose one last time, Robert Hayes smiled, lifting his glass quietly. The builder, at last, standing within the home he'd built from character, not concrete. The night was still, no ticking clock, no television noise, just the soft rasp of a pen moving across paper. Robert sat at his old wooden desk, a single lamp illuminating the faint tremor in his hand as he wrote. The house was quiet except for the sound of crickets outside, a faint hum that felt almost like company. In front of him lay a clean sheet of stationery, no logo, no mark of pride, just the kind of simplicity he'd always preferred. He began carefully, each word deliberate. "Ethan," he paused, tapping the pen lightly against the edge of the desk. For a moment, the weight of years pressed down, the laughter at his expense, the betrayal, the humiliation that had driven him to silence rather than rage. But now, that weight no longer hurt. It only reminded him of how far he'd climbed from it. He continued, his writing neat and firm. "You once taught me something without realizing it. That kindness without limits breeds entitlement. I gave, you took, and in between us grew a kind of blindness. But blindness doesn't last forever. Eventually, light finds its way in." The pen slowed as his thoughts settled. He wasn't writing to wound, not anymore. This wasn't revenge. It was release. I don't hate you, Ethan. I never really did. Hate is heavy, and I've carried enough weight for one lifetime. You broke what I built, and in trying to fix it, I found something stronger. A lesson I wish I'd learned sooner. We're all builders in our own way, but not everyone knows how to build right. Maybe now, you'll learn. He stopped again, taking a sip of tea that had long since gone cold. His eyes drifted to the photo on his desk, Melissa and Ava at the retirement party, both smiling. For once, the smile wasn't painful to look at. It was proof. You lost your company, your status, and the illusion of control. I lost time, but I regained peace. That's the better trade. Maybe one day, when the noise fades, you'll see that too. The ink glided slowly as he wrote the final lines. May you rebuild yourself. Not for pride, not for redemption, but for understanding. That's the only foundation that lasts. He signed his name quietly, Robert Hayes, then folded the letter neatly, sealing it in an unmarked envelope. A gentle knock came at the door. Clara stepped in, holding her coat. You're really going to send it? She asked softly. Robert nodded. It's the last unfinished corner of the house. She smiled faintly, taking the envelope from his hand. No return address? None needed, he said. If he understands, that's enough. If he doesn't, that's still enough. Clara studied him for a moment, her eyes warm. You're not the man who started this story. He smiled. No, I'm the man who finished it. She left quietly, the envelope tucked under her arm. The front door closed with a soft click, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Robert leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. For the first time in years, his shoulders didn't feel burdened. He wasn't waiting for justice anymore, or forgiveness, or closure. It had already arrived the moment he put pen to paper. Days later, Melissa stopped by, carrying fresh groceries and Ava's newest drawing. As she unpacked, she noticed the faint carbon impression of writing still on Robert's blotter. Did you write something? She asked casually. He smiled. A letter to the past. She tilted her head, curious but respectful. To him? He didn't answer directly, just nodded once. When Clara later told her she had mailed it, to the prison without a return, Melissa went silent. For a long time, she simply stood in the kitchen, staring at her father across the room. Then she smiled, a proud, knowing smile. You did what most people can't, she said quietly. You forgave without needing to be asked. Robert met her gaze, eyes kind. Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for what's left of you. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars rise above Atlanta, the air felt lighter, the world quieter. Somewhere, a man was reading a letter. Somewhere, a bridge had stopped burning. And in the space between silence and understanding, growth finally replaced revenge, completely, quietly, beautifully. The morning light streamed through the workshop windows, painting golden streaks across rows of lumber and shining steel tools. The air smelled of sawdust and fresh beginnings, a scent Robert had come to love again. This was no longer the factory where deals were struck and egos collided. It was something simpler, purer, a training space for young builders, where lessons weren't just about craft, but about character. A group of trade students gathered around him, eyes bright, hands calloused from honest work. Robert stood before them in his worn denim shirt, sleeves rolled up, holding a tape measure and that familiar quiet authority that had once commanded entire boardrooms. Measure twice, cut once, he said with a half smile. But remember, mistakes are just rough edges. You can sand them down if you're patient. Laughter broke out among the students, light and genuine. They admired him, not for his titles, but for his calm precision, the way he treated every piece of wood like it mattered. During a break, one of the younger boys lingered as the others dispersed. He looked no older than 16, shy but curious. Mr. Hayes? He asked. Robert turned, adjusting his glasses. Yes, son? The boy hesitated. I wish my dad worked like you. Robert's heart softened. He'd heard pain like that before, unspoken, hidden behind respect. He crouched slightly to meet the boy's eyes. Then work like the man you want him to be. he said gently. The boy nodded, not fully understanding now, but someday he would. Robert could see it in his expression, the seed of purpose being planted. The days fell into rhythm after that, mornings of sanding, afternoons of framing, and evenings of quiet reflection. Each lesson Robert taught seemed to echo outward, not just about building walls and laying foundations, but about integrity, patience, and pride in one's craft. The local news eventually picked up the story. Former industry leader mentors future builders. Robert chuckled when he saw the headline. Fame no longer thrilled him. What mattered was watching these students discover dignity in their work. Clara often stopped by, her silver hair tucked neatly under a sun hat. She had finally retired, her laughter softer, but her wit still sharp. You finally traded paperwork for planks, she teased one afternoon as she watched him demonstrate a dovetail joint. He smiled. And you finally stopped correcting my grammar in memos. She laughed, shaking her head. Now I only correct your posture. Dylan, meanwhile, had grown into his role as company head gracefully. His expansion projects ran smoothly, built on transparency and ethics, everything Robert had once dreamed of. You built this, Dylan often said when he visited. I'm just maintaining it. Robert always answered the same way. No, you're evolving it. That's better. On weekends, Melissa and little Ava would visit. The house, once filled with silence and regret, now rang with laughter and the scent of fresh cookies. Ava's drawings covered his refrigerator, crayon versions of him holding hammers, smiling beneath cartoon suns. Grandpa, this one's you building a castle, she'd say proudly. Robert would grin. That's a big dream. Maybe you'll build it with me someday. Melissa often sat on the porch during those visits, watching him chase Ava across the yard. Sometimes her eyes welled with quiet tears, gratitude mostly. The father she'd once feared losing to bitterness had returned stronger than ever. One afternoon, after the students had left, Robert lingered in the empty workshop. Sunlight caught the dust in golden swirls, dancing through the air. On the wall hung a small wooden plaque, hand-carved by his students. To Mr. Hayes, who taught us to build with heart. He ran his fingers across the letters, the wood smooth beneath his touch. For a moment, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply. This, not profit, not redemption, was his true legacy. As he locked up for the evening, Clara's voice echoed in his mind from long ago. Builders always outlast destroyers. She'd been right. Outside, the world was settling into twilight. Melissa's car pulled up just as he stepped onto the driveway. Ava ran to him, waving wildly. Grandpa, guess what? Mom says I can help you in your workshop next time. He knelt, arms open. Then we'll start a new project together, he said warmly. Ava tilted her head. What are we going to build? Robert smiled, eyes glinting with quiet pride. A new foundation. As the three of them walked back inside, the last rays of sunlight spilled across the yard, golden, steady, unbroken. The home, once hollowed by anger and loss, now pulsed with laughter and warmth. For Robert Hayes, peace was no longer a distant dream. It was built, plank by plank, lesson by lesson, heart by heart. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen curtains, soft and golden, falling across the table where plates of pancakes and steaming coffee waited. The house smelled of maple syrup, butter, and calm, a kind of peace Robert Hayes had once thought he'd never know again. He sat at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled up, hands folded, the same hands that had built homes, raised walls, and once held too many grudges. Today, they trembled slightly, but not from anger or age, from emotion. Melissa stood at the stove, humming softly, flipping pancakes the way he used to when she was little. Ava sat beside him, swinging her legs, her tiny hands busy arranging berries into a smiley face on her plate. Breakfast is ready, Melissa said, setting down the last plate. Father's Day tradition. Pancakes first, gifts later. Robert chuckled. You're stricter than any foreman I ever worked for. That's because I learned from the best, she teased, giving him a gentle pat on the shoulder before sitting down. They ate together, laughter easy, conversation light. Ava told stories about school. how she'd built a popsicle stick bridge in science class that held more weight than anyone else's. "Guess who I learned from, Grandpa?" she said proudly. Robert grinned. "Let me guess. Your mom?" Ava giggled. "No, you." He laughed softly, eyes twinkling. "Well, I guess my lessons are traveling far." After breakfast, Melissa disappeared into the other room for a moment, then returned, holding a small, neatly wrapped box. The paper was dark brown with a golden ribbon tied perfectly. "Before you say anything," she began, setting it gently in front of him. "This isn't from a store. Ava helped." Ava nodded eagerly, her grin wide. "Open it, Grandpa." Robert smiled, untying the ribbon slowly, savoring the moment, the way one opens not a gift, but a memory. Inside lay a pair of handmade leather work gloves, smooth, sturdy, and beautifully stitched. He turned them over in his hands, running a thumb over the engraving burned into the cuff. "For the man who never stopped building." For a moment, the room went still. His throat tightened. He blinked hard, the edges of his vision blurring. Melissa smiled softly. "You said once that real builders never retire. They just start teaching. I thought, you deserve something to match that." Robert let out a quiet laugh, part chuckle, part sigh. "You remembered," he whispered, voice cracking. Melissa nodded. "Of course I did." Ava climbed onto his lap and wrapped her arms around him. "We made sure they fit perfect," she said proudly. "Mom measured your old ones when you weren't looking." He hugged her close, his eyes glistening. "They're perfect," he said softly. "Absolutely perfect." He slipped the gloves on, flexing his fingers as if greeting an old friend. The leather creaked, familiar and reassuring. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The air was full of warmth, of memories finally healed. Last year's Father's Day, the cruel joke gift, the tension, the heartbreak. It all felt like a story that belonged to another man. The anger had faded, replaced by something purer, understanding, forgiveness, renewal. Melissa poured another cup of coffee and sat beside him. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think you were impossible to please, that nothing I did was enough. But now I get it. You just wanted me to build right." Robert looked at her, his voice gentle but sure. "I never wanted you to build like me, Melissa. I wanted you to build stronger." She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Maybe I finally am." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You are, and I couldn't be prouder." Outside, the sound of birds filled the air, mingling with the rustle of summer leaves. The world felt steady again, as though all the loose nails of the past had finally been set right. Ava tugged his sleeve. "Can we go to your workshop later, Grandpa? I want to build something for you this time." He smiled, heart full. "You lead the project, and I'll just follow orders." "Deal," she said, laughing. Melissa leaned back, watching them, her father and daughter side by side. The pain, the pride, the years of distance had melted into something simple, love rebuilt. As the day stretched on, Robert found himself looking at the gloves again, not as a symbol of work, but of worth. They weren't just leather and stitching. They were memory, redemption, and legacy, all in one. Later, as they stepped outside together, the sunlight glinting off his workshop windows, Robert felt something he hadn't in a long time. Completeness. Father's Day no longer hurt. It healed. And as Ava ran ahead toward the workshop, calling his name, Robert smiled. Not just as a builder or a father, but as a man who had finally finished the hardest project of all, rebuilding his family. The sun had long dipped below the trees, leaving behind a gentle warmth in the air and a sky dusted with the first stars. Robert Hayes sat on his porch, the same place he'd once sat alone, weighed down by silence and memory. Now, that silence was softer, not the sound of emptiness, but of peace. The old wooden boards creaked beneath his rocking chair as he leaned back, a mug of coffee resting between his hands. The faint hum of summer crickets filled the evening. Across the yard, the porch light glowed steadily, its amber halo spilling across the steps, illuminating the faint scuffs of a lifetime of comings and goings. Clara sat beside him, her cup steaming in the cool night air. The two of them didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. They had both learned that real comfort didn't come from words, but from presence. Finally, Clara turned to him. "So," she asked quietly, "no regrets?" Robert's lips curved into a small, thoughtful smile. He looked down at his hands, rough, scarred, shaped by decades of work, and then out toward the yard where fireflies blinked like tiny lanterns in the grass. "No," he said softly. "Every crack taught me where to reinforce." Clara chuckled lightly. "That sounds like something you'd tell your students." He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's something I had to tell myself for too long." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence. The air carried the faint scent of lilacs and sawdust, a mix of nature and labor, of rest and effort. From inside the house came the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of cooling wood, the gentle rhythm of a home alive. Down the walkway, Melissa and Ava stood by the gate. Ava waved both arms, her voice carrying through the quiet evening. "Good night, Grandpa," Robert waved back, smiling wide. "Good night, Builder." Melissa lingered for a moment longer, smiling. "We'll come by tomorrow. Ava wants to finish her birdhouse." He nodded. "I'll have the paint ready." As they drove away, the headlights briefly crossed the porch, and for a second, he caught his reflection in the window. An older man, yes, but not the same tired figure who once came home from a company that had forgotten his worth. This man had purpose, peace, and people who finally saw him clearly. Clara watched him quietly. "You did it, you know," she said. He turned. "Did what?" "Built something that lasts, and not just the buildings, the people, the principles." Robert smiled faintly, eyes on the road where Melissa's car had disappeared. "I used to think building was about structure," he murmured. "Turns out it's about strength, the kind that holds even when no one's watching." Clara tilted her head. "That's the kind of foundation no storm can touch." They sat there until the fireflies thickened in the yard, blinking like living embers. Somewhere, a dog barked, then quieted. The world had finally slowed to his rhythm. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the porch light. Its glow wasn't bright, but it was steady, the kind of light you left on for someone you knew would come home eventually. He thought of all the years it had burned unnoticed, through cold winters, lonely nights, arguments, and silence. Yet it had never gone out, just like him. "Funny thing about that light," he said softly. "It's been up there since the day we moved in. Never replaced it. Still works." Clara smiled. "Maybe it knows whose porch it belongs to." Robert chuckled, the sound deep and easy. "Maybe, or maybe it just learned how to endure." He leaned back in his chair again, the gentle rhythm of its motion matching the quiet pulse of the night. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he didn't mind. It wasn't about the drink, it was about the moment. For a long time, he simply watched the yard. Every blade of grass, every shimmer of light, every passing breeze seemed to whisper a single truth. Everything built with care, eventually, stands. "Legacy," Clara said softly, breaking the stillness. "That's what this is, isn't it?" Robert nodded, his gaze still on the porch light. "Not the kind they write in newspapers, the quiet kind, the kind you leave behind in people's hands and hearts." She smiled. "The best kind." The clock inside chimed softly, marking another hour. Robert stood, stretching, his back creaking like the porch boards beneath his feet. He took one last sip of his coffee, then placed the mug down on the rail. He looked once more toward the light, still glowing, unwavering. "Let's leave it on," he said quietly. "For them, for tomorrow." Clara nodded. "For legacy." As they stepped inside, the porch light stayed on, burning warm against the night, a silent promise that the builder's work would never truly be done. The garage door groaned open for the first time in years, letting sunlight spill across shelves lined with old tools and jars of rusty nails. The scent of sawdust and oil filled the air, a smell Robert Hayes had always associated with creation, not labor. His workshop, once silent and cluttered, breathed again. Ava darted inside, eyes wide. "Grandpa, It's like a secret cave. Robert laughed, setting down a small wooden plank on the workbench. Not a cave, kiddo. This is where builders tell their stories, one nail at a time. Over the next hour, the place filled with noise, not the mechanical rhythm of forklifts or corporate buzzers, but laughter, chatter, the sound of children discovering how wood felt beneath their hands. A few neighborhood kids had joined Ava, curious about Grandpa Bob's workshop. Their sneakers scuffed the floor. Their questions came faster than he could answer. "Why do you tap the nail twice before hitting it hard?" one boy asked. Robert smiled. "Because rushing breaks things. Measure twice, trust once." The kids repeated it like a chant, giggling, not yet realizing how deeply the line would stick. To Robert, it wasn't just about wood. It was about life. Every mistake, every loss, had taught him to pause, look again, and only then commit. By noon, small birdhouses began to take shape on the benches, uneven edges, crooked roofs, but full of charm. The air rang with the thump of hammers, the scrape of sandpaper, and Ava's delighted squeals whenever she managed to drive a nail straight. Melissa stood in the doorway, arms folded, smiling softly as she recorded the chaos on her phone. "You've turned my dad into a TikTok star," she joked under her breath to Clara, who had wandered in with lemonade. Clara chuckled. "He was always a star. People just didn't notice the light before." Melissa nodded, filming as Robert leaned over Ava's shoulder, guiding her small hands on the saw handle. "Slow and steady. Let the blade do the work," he said gently. "Like patience?" Ava asked. "Exactly," he replied, eyes crinkling. "Patience builds straight lines." Later that evening, Melissa edited the clips into a short video, a simple montage of wood shavings, sunlight, and laughter. She added captions quoting her father's lines, "Measure twice, trust once." "Patience builds straight lines." She posted it online under the title, "Wisdom from Grandpa Bob." By morning, it had gone viral. Comments flooded in, people thanking Grandpa Bob for his words, sharing how his advice reminded them of their own fathers, their mentors, their teachers. One comment read, "He's not just building birdhouses, he's rebuilding people." When Melissa showed him the post, Robert laughed. "All I did was teach a few kids how not to waste wood." "You taught them how not to waste life," Melissa said quietly. He paused, looking at her, really looking, and for the first time in years, saw the same spark she'd had as a little girl, the one who used to sit in this very workshop, holding the flashlight while he worked. Ava ran in, holding a freshly painted birdhouse. "Look, Grandpa, it's crooked, but the birds won't mind, right?" He knelt, brushing a bit of blue paint from her cheek. "No, sweetheart, birds don't care about perfect. They care about safe, just like people." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long golden rays across the yard. The sound of hammers faded, replaced by laughter echoing into the distance. Laughter that felt freer, lighter, unburdened. Robert leaned against the doorway, watching his granddaughter chase the other kids with a paintbrush. The house behind him was full again, not of things, but of life. He looked up at the sign Ava had painted above the workbench. "Measure twice, trust once." The letters were uneven, the paint smudged, but to him, it was perfect. The old builder smiled, running his fingers along the edge of the bench. For years, he had built things for others. Now, at last, he was building something that would outlast him. Laughter, lessons, legacy. In the quiet hum of his workshop, surrounded by sawdust and sunlight, Robert Hayes found the sound he'd been missing all along. The music of peace rebuilt. The morning was still, the kind of stillness that holds its breath before the world begins to move again. A thin veil of mist hung over the small cemetery on the edge of town, the grass glistening faintly, with dew. Robert stood among a small gathering, his hat held to his chest, his eyes fixed on the simple wooden casket resting beneath a maple tree. Clara Brooks had passed the way she had lived, quietly, gracefully, without fanfare. There were no long eulogies, no grand speeches, just a few people who had truly known her, standing in the cool morning light. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the folded program. Dylan stood beside him, solemn, eyes red-rimmed but steady. Melissa was on his other side, her hand resting gently on his arm. Even Ava was there, dressed in a small black coat, holding a single white lily that she placed carefully beside the flowers at the grave. The pastor's voice was soft, almost blending with the rustle of leaves overhead. She lived with kindness. She left with peace, and she taught by simply being. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, the words sinking deep. Clara's face flickered in his memory, her knowing smile, the way she raised an eyebrow when she caught him overthinking, her steady voice that always seemed to find him when he was about to fall apart. She'd been there in every chapter, not as a savior, but as a reminder that even broken things could be rebuilt. After the final prayer, the small crowd began to disperse. Robert stayed behind. The air was cold, but he didn't feel it. Dylan lingered for a moment, offering a quiet nod before walking back toward the path. Melissa stayed a little longer, watching her father. She didn't speak. She knew he needed silence more than comfort right now. When it was just him and the wind, Robert knelt beside the headstone. His knees creaked against the damp earth, but he didn't care. He traced the fresh engraving with his fingers. Clara Brooks, a light that built others. He smiled faintly through tears. "You'd probably tell me not to make a fuss," he murmured, "but I never was good at listening to you." From his pocket, he pulled out a small pendant, a silver hammer charm, simple, weathered, engraved with a single word, Grace. He'd had it made years ago, after Clara had helped him find his footing again. She never knew about it. He placed it gently at the base of the grave. "For the woman who never let me break," he said softly. The words caught in his throat, breaking just slightly. His eyes filled, but there was no shame in the tears, only gratitude. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, then looked toward the maple tree, its branches swaying gently. In the rustle of leaves, he almost heard her voice, steady, teasing, wise. "Keep building, Robert. Don't stop just because one of the bricks is gone." He smiled through the ache. "I won't," he whispered. "You helped me build the best part of me." Melissa stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "She really loved you, Dad," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "She was one of the few people who saw what I could be, not just what I was." They stood there for a moment longer, the sound of the breeze and birds filling the silence between them. Then Robert straightened slowly, giving the grave one last look. As he turned to leave, he glanced back, the pendant glinting softly in the morning light, a small symbol of a bond built from wisdom, friendship, and grace. Walking down the gravel path, he didn't feel heavy. The grief was real, yes, but it was clean, like rain washing dust from old stone. Clara had given him enough light to carry forward, enough faith to keep building. And as the sun began to pierce through the mist, Robert Hayes whispered into the quiet morning, "Goodbye, Clara. You rebuilt me right." 10 years had passed since the storm, since the collapse that nearly took everything Robert had built. In those years, Hayes Logistics had done something rare. It had grown not through ambition, but through integrity. The once chaotic office now pulsed with quiet efficiency. Glass walls gleamed, sunlight filled open spaces, and the air carried a calm rhythm of confidence rather than competition. Employees smiled when they passed each other in the halls, something Robert had never seen in his corporate years. On the far wall of the main lobby hung a bronze plaque, "In honor of Robert Hayes, for reminding us that strength begins with rebuilding." Robert stood before it now, hands in the pockets of his worn jacket. His hair had turned almost completely silver, but his eyes still carried that familiar spark. The quiet observation of a man who had seen failure and found peace within it. Dylan walked up behind him, now in his 40s, wearing the easy authority of someone who had earned his place rather than inherited it. "You know, they insisted on putting that up," he said with a grin. "I told them you'd hate the attention." Robert chuckled. "You were right." He looked around. The place felt alive. The company had doubled in size, but its heart had somehow stayed small and human. He saw young managers mentoring interns, workers greeting each other by name, and a framed photo of the founding team, Robert, Dylan, and Melissa, displayed beside the company's mission statement. "So," Robert said, turning toward his son, "you did it." Dylan shook his head. No, we did it. You fixed the foundation. Robert smiled, his voice soft but firm. No, son, I just stopped it from collapsing. You're the one who built what came after. Dylan paused, his expression caught between pride and emotion. You always downplay it, Dad, but none of this would exist if you hadn't walked back in when you did. Robert's gaze drifted toward the conference room, where Melissa was standing at the head of a meeting table, confidently leading a presentation. She was the company's chief financial officer now, respected, firm, and transparent. She carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had earned every ounce of trust. Melissa spotted them through the glass and waved, smiling. Robert lifted a hand in return, pride swelling quietly in his chest. I think you two fixed more than the business, he said softly. You fixed our name. Dylan crossed his arms, watching his sister with a proud smile. She's the one who kept us grounded. If I ever got too ambitious, she'd remind me where we came from. Robert laughed quietly. Sounds like your mother. The mention of her name brought a moment of silence, not sadness, but gentle memory. They walked together through the office, nodding to familiar faces. Employees stopped to greet Robert, not with the rehearsed politeness of old corporate days, but with genuine respect. Mr. Hayes, one younger manager said, you probably don't remember me, but I started here during the rebuild. Everything I've learned about leadership comes from your old workshop videos. Robert smiled warmly. Then you probably learned more from my mistakes than my successes. The manager grinned. That's what made them real. As they stepped into the courtyard, Robert looked up at the company sign, Hayes Logistics. The name didn't feel like ownership anymore. It felt like legacy. Dylan turned to him. You ever miss it? The day-to-day grind? Robert chuckled. No, I like the quiet. The workshop's full of sawdust and laughter these days. Dylan nodded. Still teaching kids how to build? Still trying, Robert said. They're better listeners than executives ever were. They both laughed, the kind of easy laughter that comes from years of forgiveness and growth. As Robert prepared to leave, Melissa stepped out to join them. Board meeting next week, she said to Dylan, then turned to her father. You're coming to the company dinner, right? Robert shrugged with a small smile. If you promise there won't be another plaque, she laughed. No promises. He hugged them both, strong, steady, grateful. Walking toward the exit, he glanced back once more at the plaque on the wall. For the man who had once lost everything, it was a quiet kind of triumph, not the kind made of power or profit, but of peace. As the doors closed behind him, sunlight spilled across the bronze words. Robert Hayes had finally built something that would stand, not because it was flawless, but because it was honest. The late afternoon sun spread gold across the meadow as Robert tightened the last bolt on the small park bench. It sat beneath a wide oak tree, the kind that had stood long before any of them were born, its roots deep, its branches patient. The soft rasp of sandpaper whispered against the wood, the smell of cedar mingling with the scent of grass. When he was done, he leaned back, wiping the sweat from his brow. The bench wasn't extravagant, no polished marble or sleek metal, just honest craftsmanship. It was the kind of piece that asked to be sat on to hold stories and laughter. With a small carving knife, Robert etched into the backrest, "Legacy is built, not inherited." He ran his thumb over the letters, each groove steady and deliberate. It was the phrase that had come to define his life, his failures, his redemption, and everything between. He stepped back to admire it. The bench faced west, where the setting sun brushed the sky in hues of orange and rose. A gentle wind rustled the leaves above, scattering soft light across the wood. Moments later, he heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Melissa, Dylan, and little Ava appeared, a picnic basket in hand. "Grandpa!" Ava squealed, running up and throwing her arms around his legs. He bent down, laughing as he lifted her into the air. "There's my little helper, ready to test my craftsmanship?" She nodded eagerly. Together they sat on the new bench. It held steady under their weight, strong, simple, true. Melissa spread a checkered blanket nearby, unpacking sandwiches, cookies, and lemonade. Dylan set down a small portable speaker, and soft jazz filled the quiet space. It wasn't a grand celebration, but it was perfect in its simplicity. "So, this is your big project," Dylan said, looking at the bench. "You've still got it, Dad." Robert smiled. "Took me longer than I expected. Guess I'm not as fast as I used to be." Melissa sat beside him, studying the carving. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "It's what you've always tried to teach us." He shrugged, eyes glinting with humor. "Took me most of my life to learn it myself." For a while, they ate and talked about the company, about Ava's school play, about Clara, and the old days. The conversation drifted like the evening breeze, light, unhurried, full of warmth. Ava wandered toward the oak tree, picking up acorns and arranging them into tiny circles. Then she looked back and asked, "Grandpa, are you happy now?" The question hung in the air, simple, honest. Robert paused, then smiled, a slow, deep smile that carried years of exhaustion and peace. "Finally, yes," he said. Melissa's eyes shimmered, and Dylan looked down, quietly moved. They sat together as the sun began to dip behind the horizon. The light turned soft and golden, the kind that made everything look tender, like the world itself was exhaling. Robert leaned back, resting his hand on the bench's armrest. He could feel the pulse of the wood, the quiet life of it. He thought about all the things he'd built, buildings, companies, dreams, and eventually, forgiveness. But this small wooden bench beneath an old oak, felt like the most honest creation of all. Ava crawled into his lap as the first fireflies began to flicker. "Tell me a story," she whispered. He chuckled. "About what?" "About when you were young." He thought for a moment, then began softly. "Once there was a man who forgot what really mattered, but life reminded him. One nail, one choice, one lesson at a time." She smiled sleepily, her head resting on his chest. Melissa and Dylan sat quietly beside them, watching the sunset burn into the horizon, a perfect, glowing farewell. As the last light faded, Robert looked at the carving once more. Legacy is built, not inherited. He reached over and turned on the small lantern beside the bench. The light glowed softly, steady against the gathering dusk, just like the porch light he'd once kept on for hope. And as the evening settled around them, Robert Hayes finally rested. Not as a builder of things, but as a builder of people, of love, of lasting peace.